I need to activate my slides now, yeah?
No, Bruno will do this.
Okay.
Então, bom dia, uma boa tarde, uma boa noite para todo mundo. Eu não sei quando é que vocês vão assistir isso. Meu nome é Marcos Silva, eu trabalho em Recife, né, na Federal de Pernambuco, e estou representando também a diretoria da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Sejam todos bem-vindos e bem-vindas para esse 7º Normativa, né, em apoio, em colaboração com a Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Normativa é esse grupo de pesquisa qual eu coordeno aqui em Recife, que trata sobre normatividade na lógica, na linguagem, nas ciências cognitivas e também em políticas, né, tentando fazer esse arco de discussões. A gente está aproveitando aqui, né, na plataforma da SBFA, a gente vai ter um grande congresso em julho, né, aqui Cesar vai estar também. Em verdade, o Erik iria estar também, mas houve um problema de agenda, aí a gente tentou fazer esse evento antes, até para chamar a atenção da comunidade para esse evento grandão. Um congresso para quase 300 pessoas, internacional aqui em Recife, é o 9º congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Espero que todos possam vir prestigiar. Acho que vai ser muito interessante para ter um panorama do que está sendo feito em filosofia analítica aqui no Brasil, na América Latina. Então, todos e todas muito bem-vindos. Então, essa aqui é uma espécie de prévia desse encontro. Esse 7º Normativo é uma prévia para esse 9º Congresso, né, da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica. Então, é um prazer muito grande receber o professor Cesar Meurer, da Universidade Estadual do Norte Fluminense, e também o professor Erik Myin, que eu conheço há muito tempo já, mais de uma década. Ele já pôde visitar a gente em Fortaleza, quando eu trabalhava em Fortaleza, para lançar um dos seus livros pela MIT. Eu já editei um número especial com um grupo lá de Fortaleza da computação, um amigo, o Francis Kleber Ferreira, um número na revista Síntese também sobre Radical Ways of Cognition, que o Erik Myin participou diretamente sobre isso. Eu tive a oportunidade também de resenhar todos esses livros do Erik Myin, e agora é uma espécie de resenha crítica, né, uma recepção crítica dessa obra do Erik Myin, que não tem nem um ano, não tem nem um mês de publicação. Foi publicado agora dia 19 de maio, e a gente está tão na vanguarda da coisa que a gente já pegou um livro antes mesmo dele ser publicado para discutir, fazer essa recepção crítica do Erik Myin. So now I will switch to English. So Erik Myin, thank you very much for your attention, your time, for having this moment with us, for the reception of your book. So that's interesting what I'm talking to people in Portuguese now, is because this book it's not even a month old. So it was published in the second part of May, and then we have this book and this critical reception. Let's call attention for our how fast we are to receiving what you are saying. So for today, we have 3 days of this critical reception. Today we're going to have Professor Cesar Meurer from the Universidade Federal, Universidade Estadual do Norte Fluminense, and also Erik Myin will be in the 3 days with us. Today, we're going to have my presentation and Cesar's presentation, also Erik's presentation for a more general presentation of his new book, Of a Different Mind. Tomorrow, we're going to have André Leclerc, Maria Eunice, and also Mariana Browns. André is working in Brasilia now, and the other 2 professors is working in Marília, which is in São Paulo. And on Thursday, unfortunately, Professor Pablo from Chile will not make it. Unfortunately, he will not present. But then we're going to have a presentation by Giovanni Rola on Thursday from Federal University of Bahia, and then Erik Myin will make it to sort out and set up all the criticism and with a new agenda for cognitive science, philosophy of cognitive science. So we have this presentation now, just because I invited Erik to come to Brazil in person to Recife and to have a big meeting, but unfortunately we didn't get the enough funding for this now, so we switched to this presentation online, and it's nice also to have this more recorded for a broader audience and community here in South America and abroad as well. And Erik, I'm saying that this is a kind of preview for our big Congress, our NINF. We have this Congress for the last 16 years in Brazil, for the Brazilian Analytical Society, yeah? The Society for Analytical Philosophy. The Brazilian Society for Analytical Philosophy will take place in the last week of July. I also invited you for this to be a keynote speaker, but it didn't work because of the problems with the schedule and also other stuff. But then maybe Erik can visit us in person later on in the future, and also we also organize a conference in Berlin next March in person, maybe with online presentations as well. And we will talk about language and also cognition and inference, all of these interesting points that we are. So just a final remark. Sorry for talking too much. I'm also talking to André Leclerc, which is our leader here in philosophy of mind and psychology in Brazil, maybe to organize a book symposium with all the presentations, the text that comes from the presentations from these 3 days, this small workshop. So what we can do is to organize these presentations with a nice answer by Erik Myin to a book symposium, an open access journal later on. So this is pretty much the project, and also invite other researchers that were not able to come for this presentation today. Okay, so this is the pretty much the schedule, and thank you again, Erik Myin and Cesar, for today, and then we come back later on. Now, Erik Myin, the floor is yours, and thank you again for coming, for your time.
Okay, I should thank you. I'm very happy to participate in this event. I'll try to be quick, and I'll try to, I won't say much more. I'm going to talk about, oh no, you can't see it because the background is blurred, but this is my book. It actually exists. Here it is. I can hold it. And I'll now, there's a lot in the book which I can't cover now, but I'll give some main lines which I think will resonate with what people will say. And yeah, it gives you certainly the gist of much of the book. So, I wrote it with motivation. What was my motivation? I've been teaching philosophy of psychology for quite a time, and I wasn't very happy with most of the textbooks, which were excellent in many ways, but which were also a bit one-sided. Not a bit one-sided. I think they were one-sided. So, and they presented a particular sort of sometimes stereotyped view of the mind, in which functionalism was the great thing and the computational view was very prominent. I thought, and the embodied views of the mind were very selectively or marginally treated, and I thought, no, this should be redone. Why should it be redone? Because I read with great pleasure when I was young. I read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a famous book by Thomas Kuhn, and there are some very nice passages in the book in which he talks about the role of textbooks. And I've always remembered, and I always thought it was very insightful, how he described how textbooks shape a field. They provide the basic assumptions. They provide the basic theoretical framework in which whole generations of people are going to practice their profession. They define a problem space. They give the most important concepts in a certain way, etc., etc. So they have a great importance. So in the received view, in all those books, I show a few of them, they all have the same title, Introduction to the Philosophy of Mind, or Philosophy of Mind. You have a very similar core of theses, theories, concepts, and also attitudes to philosophy. And I think that they are typical for a certain period right before now or still now, and they have there's a certain view in there, which is itself a historical view, but which get treated in those books as if it were the view on philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology. There's a definition, for example, of the problem space, very simplified. It defines the problems of philosophy of mind as having to do with cognition on the one side, and then you have a big problem of, or some problem of intentionality there. On the other hand, there's this problem about consciousness, and you have the hard problem of phenomenal consciousness. And often the whole book is woven or has this division of the problem space in the background. If you then go to the cognition part, well, there's much sympathy for, even if there's not always an explicit defense of it. There's a lot of attention with some sympathy on the idea that the world is seen through internal models, or that cognition happens because we have internal models that represent the world and mediate our access to the world. And on these models, then cognitive operations are performed, and thereby cognition takes place. This is, of course, the received view in much cognitive science in 60s, 70s, 80s, 60s also. The brain is seen as an evolved computer, and action and perception are sort of outcomes of this view. Of cognitive operations performed on cognitive models. I call this a cognition first view because you in the end, I think this view rests on a grounding of cognition in cognition. Cognitive operations, internal operations, which happen on data inputs which we get in from the world, and cognition really happens by the working of the cognitive operations. And the cognitive operations are sort of taken for granted. They have evolved, but there's no real explanation for them, I think. Consciousness. That was cognition. Consciousness, well, it's the discussions in these books about consciousness are very much influenced by the idea that consciousness is a scientifically intractable problem. It's for the moment. It's very, very hard to understand it naturalistically. There's a lot of attention to the explanatory gap kind of arguments, hard problem of consciousness. These are really taken very seriously. There are a lot of reasons why such a view can be so prominent, because it's been present in the history of philosophy, Western philosophy, well, since Plato and certainly before. In Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Hume, von Helmholtz, you find all people who have some commitment, some very explicit commitment to that kind of view. It's there in the stream of Western philosophy thinking, and it's not just a small boat; it's a big boat on which many thinkers are. Now, this view has been present throughout history of Western thinking, but in the 20th century, it gained in impact, and it gained in scientific credibility because of the developments, all kinds of scientific developments, mathematical developments, logical developments, and one of them, which was foremost, is of course the emergence of computationalism, the emergence of theory of computation, the emergence of actual physical computers. Okay, so now that kind of thinking, which you found already in some more or less creative or free way, imaginistic way throughout the history of philosophy, it became anchored in very hard science. Representationalism, mediationism, the kind of view of the mind held by many philosophers before, now became a scientific doctrine. Representations became symbols or numerical vectors in computers, and cognitive operations became mechanized by being equated with simple operations that a simple computational mechanical machine could do. Okay. In the textbooks on philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, you also get a view of the history of the field, the history of philosophy of mind. So you have a typical progress story about how initially very wrong theories got improved and then still had mistakes, and then got improved again, and finally it reaches the best theory, which is a broadly functionalist way of understanding the mind. So you have a sequence of dualism, which then gives behaviorism, which gives identity theory, and then comes the crowning achievement, some kind of functionalism, which is wedded to the computational view of mind, and then you have the ultimate good view. Well, I've always thought this was very one-sided, and I've always thought it was though connecting to the history, also very ahistorical to promote this view as the only sound philosophical view. Because if you look at the history of thinking about the mind, you find a lot of alternative philosophies. You find a lot of philosophers that have defended ideas which were quite in tension with the view defended or central in those standard textbooks. And some of the people which I all deal with, and these are just some of them in my book, are Thomas Reid, the fantastic Thomas Reid. I'll return to him, the Scottish critic of Hume and Locke, John Dewey, pragmatist, Skinner. I know in Brazil people are more sympathetic to behaviorism than elsewhere, but Skinner plays as a very poor theorist in those standard treatments. But if you read Skinner, I think this is very undeserved, and I think he needs to be. He needs to done more justice than has been done elsewhere. I also, sorry for the missing D here, I also pay much more attention than typical textbooks to Ludwig Wittgenstein, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Gilbert Ryle. I think they're very important. Normally they're sort of briefly mentioned, if at all, and then there are some arguments which put them aside for good. I think that's quite problematic, because all these people, they have criticisms of the kind of theses that are held in the standard treatments, which I think have not been refuted, certainly not refuted as devastatingly as it is allegedly held for true in those books. I think many of their reasons for their views which are different from the tradition, are still standing. They have their very strong arguments, which haven't been refuted, and they have positive views also, I think, of cognition as an achieved interaction that essentially evolves world social context and is deeply, 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 deeply historical. We are historical creatures. Our history matters for what we now do, and what we now do could only be done because we have a particular history. These are the kind of views that they hold. Okay, let me detail. They're not the same. I don't wanna make some kind of unity view out of them, or say they're committed to a rigid common doctrine. No, they're all different, but there are common themes which play in all of them. Let's go to the fantastic Thomas Reid, who's really I started reading him for good during the writing of this book, and this was really a great joy and a great surprise to me how good and how sharp and how actual his writings are. And he wrote when he was pretty old. He wrote when he was 75, I think. He wrote his major work, or in his 70s. Good. Once he was a foremost philosopher. He was a big university professor. David Hume never got a job at university because of all kinds of reasons, but still, if you look at the standard treatments now, it's Hume is much bigger than Reid, but it was not the case in the past. Okay, so what is his target? His target is the Locke-Hume tradition of mediationism. This is the idea that we immediately do not perceive the world, but images or ideas in the mind, not reality itself. Our input from the world is seen in terms of simple sensations from which complexes are forged by means of cognitive operations. And these cognitive operations then also can be performed on complexes, the complexes which are formed, and so you get cognition going. There are not so many arguments for the view of Locke and Hume in their writings. There are only some. And here is a sort of a bland statement first by David Hume, in which he commits to this view without argument by saying nothing can ever be present to the mind but an image in perception. It's a well-known citation. But he does give some argument, and the argument he gives is by means of the example of a table. He says the view of a table diminishes when we walk away from it. And he sees that as proof of the fact that we're not in touch with the world, the table itself, but with its image. For seems to be the reasoning, if you are in touch with the table itself, the table doesn't diminish in size when you walk away from it. So if you were in touch with it, the table would remain as big as it was, as it really is. But that doesn't happen. Therefore, we are in touch only with the image. No, says Reid, and I'm just going very quick. No. We do see the table. Perception is direct, and we don't have this access to the table itself via inferential cognitive operations operating on more primitive inputs, sensations, etc. What are his arguments? Very succinctly, mediation can't be true because if mediation is true, we don't have access to the world at all. Okay, you can think of the mediationist picture as requiring a kind of bootstrapping to get access to the world. What is bootstrapping? You all know, I think, the Baron von Munchausen here. What did the Baron von Munchausen do? He pulled himself up from his horse he pulled himself up out of a morass by pulling on his own hair. That's bootstrapping. Now, if you hear me describe bootstrapping, you must come to the conclusion, there's something wrong with bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is impossible, okay? Sure it is. Von Munchausen was a fictional figure. Bootstrapping can happen in a fictional work. You can't bootstrap in the real world. And if mediationism requires bootstrapping to give you access to the world, mediationism is wrong. Inferentialism fail. All these kinds of hidden cognitive operations, which we now would call inferences, they don't happen, says Reed. There's no evidence for it. And importantly, a story can be told about our access to the world which does not have recourse to these kinds of hidden operations. And here he gives the example, or he returns to Hume's example of seeing a table. And contrary to Hume, Reed says that the fact that the table appears to diminish in size when you walk away from it, Reed doesn't see that as a hindrance, as a hurdle to having access to the world, but as a condition under which you have access to the world. If you think from it in a mathematical way, you can see that because of our changing relation to the table, the size of the table as projected to us, it must change. And indeed, it is because the size changes when we walk away from it that we see the reality of the table. We see the objective table because of the transformations it makes when we move towards it. In the transformations, through the transformations, we see the real table. Okay, that's the idea. It will return. Okay, and Reed turns that into an argument against Hume by saying, by playing an explanatory card. He says, look, with my perspectival story, I can give you a nice, understandable story about how the perceived size of the table changes with my relation to the table. I can with my non-mediation story, with my story, which doesn't believe that I don't have access to the world, I can give a perfect story about how my visual relation to the table changes and how my experience changes and how this changing experience gives me access to the table. Hume, on the other hand, has a totally non-explanatory exercise to do, or as a non-explanatory story to tell. He just has images in the mind that change, and he can't account for why this change is happening. Okay, Berkeley, the idealist, had that. God makes sure that the patterns in your mind are well-formed patterns. But if you take away God, or if you don't involve him, her in your story, you don't have this explanatory story, which Reed can provide. Okay, good. Reed doesn't stop at perception. He's against this imagistic or mediationist picture also when it comes to imagination. He says, how should we think about imagining a centaur? He rejects the idea that you imagine a centaur by entertaining a mental image of a centaur understood in a certain way. What's his argument? He says, well, when you imagine a centaur, you imagine something that has a head, that runs, that breathes, etc. You don't imagine a mental image. If you think that a mental image is necessary or is the absolute condition for imagining a centaur, you're confusing two senses in which imagination has an object. Imagination has an object in being about something, in there being an object that it is about. Okay, but saying that that is all correct. This is the way in which an imagination has an object, but the object shouldn't be, or the fact that that imagination has an object shouldn't be taken as implying that the object is a mental image. So saying that you have an image of a counter is just saying one is imagining a centaur, not that there is this mental image before one's mind that one is accessing. It's subtle, and this can be seen from this quotation. To infer that there really is an image in the mind distinct from the operation of conceiving of the object is to be misled by an analogical expression, as if from the phrases of deliberating and balancing things in the mind, we should infer that there really is a balance existing in the mind for weighting motives and arguments. Okay? Just saying that one is imagining is correct, so we can imagine, but Reid points out that it should be understood as the activity of imagining. Okay? And you can even understand having an image of a centaur, you can even say that, but you should understand it as engaging in the activity without concluding that there must be, because of the imagining of a centaur, an object which is imagined in the sense of an object in the sense of a mental image that is accessed. That would be to use the word which I'll turn to in the next slide, that would be to reify, and Reid is criticizing the reification. Okay. Reification, I think, well, and not only me, criticism of reification can be found very, very prominently in the work of John Dewey, the pragmatist philosopher. And that connects him to Reid. And that you can find these connections between all those thinkers which I am now talking about. There's this famous reflex arc paper, of course, in which Reid argues against the reification of sensation. Okay, it's very famous. I'm not going to say much about it. You have his example of a child that puts his fingers near a flame, and the point that Dewey wants to make is that you cannot picture this process in which the child finds out about the warmth and retracts, etc., as if you think about the flame in terms of a pre-existing sensation which sort of incorporates already everything that will happen to the child when it gets in touch with him. Dewey, on the other hand, emphasizes the necessary activity of the child. The child seeks the flame. The child can approach it. The child will have certain reactions. And what the flame becomes to mean is something that gets only constituted in the process. Okay? So only at the end of the process you have a clear role for the flame. And if you think about this role that the flame plays in terms of a fixed sensation which was there already before the process and which sort of sets the whole process in motion, you have inverted what really happens, because what the flame means and what the experience that comes that gets formed throughout the process, what it really is, can only be pinpointed once you consider the whole process. Okay, and having the wrong view is seeing the sensation as a pre-existing thing that has it all, is to make a reification. You make something which is the result of a process into its cause. Okay, now you can apply this thinking more generally, this thinking which was applied to sensation here by Reid. And here's an example which, Dewey. Here's an example which I don't have from Dewey, which I make up myself. Consider, you can think of the skilled piano performance of an expert player. You could think of it in terms of fixed knowledge which drives the playing, as if the piano player was looking at an internal score and then following the internal score. But then you would reify the knowledge which is expressed and which is manifested and which is in the skillful playing into something that a hypothetical entity which you place before the performance and which you make into the cause of it. The alternative is to think of the knowledge as in the person and in the playing itself. You don't have to make that knowledge into an object which is the alleged cause of it. That would be to reify it and to commit what Dewey calls the historical fallacy. It's making the result of a process into an antecedent cause of it. Okay, and I can see that at work. I can connect that with Reed's criticism of the unicorn. Okay, let's go on. Just one slide on Skinner. I'm very brief. I'm going to be very brief about it. Skinner, of course, has this very bad name in current introductions together with behaviorism. Well, just a few words to say that his theory is really an evolutionary theory. It's an operant selectionism. It's very action-oriented. It's very much in line with what theorists say nowadays. He says that the skull is not an important boundary, which is very extended mind-like, etc. And it's very much more, it goes so much beyond an input-output behaviorism. It allows theoretically for temporally remote reinforced actions, preparations for actions and preparations for preparations. So getting ready for an action and getting ready for getting ready in his system are all elements that he tries to account for in his system. So it's so much richer, and it has not been destroyed by the criticism that allegedly have destroyed it. Or in any case, much more needs to be said about it. Okay, let's go on with another important element in the kind of thing, or the kind of, embodied friendly thinkers which are against the current textbook tradition in philosophy of mind, Wittgenstein and Ryle. There's a lot that I can't cover here, unfortunately, but a main point which I think connects very nicely with Dewey's critique of the historical fallacies, their work on rule following. We follow rules all the time in speaking grammatical sentences, in doing mathematics. We have all these cognitive practices in which are rule governed, or which are happen in a normative space of rules. Well, the big point in both the work of Wittgenstein and Ryle is that external rule following can't be the result of, or the fundamental result of, internal rule following. You can't have basic internal rule following at the basis of external rule following. Why not? Well, because then you don't have accounted for the internal rule following. And you can see, then you have these infinite regresses, okay? And you can see that this is a different way of formulating the kind of critique that you find in the historical fallacy as formulated by Dewey. Good. So there are common themes, like if you listen to music from the 60s, there are a lot of 60s bands here, the usual suspects and more. You hear they play on similar kind of themes. They do very many similar things in different ways, but there's something that unites them, and it's the same with those thinkers. And some keywords that characterize what unites them is activity, context, history, deification. They all point to the importance of these things. And they also have a general positive view that's implicit sometimes, or sometimes explicit, and I call it an action-first view. Cognition is seen as whole organism environment interaction. Without, so you have intelligent activity in the world without the need for modeling of the world. Okay, you've in beginning I said that the traditional picture is this idea of you have, when you act intelligently, when cognition happens, there's a model and cognitive operations that happen on this model. Well, there they're endorsing the opposite view. You can have all kinds of structured activity, which is happening in a structured world, but structure needn't be replicated in some way that drives the activity. Explanations for this cognitive activity lies in the whole organism interaction with the environment. The brain plays a role in that, but it's more of an enabling role, and the brain doesn't engage in mechanical versions of the kind of cognitive activities which we overtly engage in, like writing a number on a piece of paper, like a Turing machine does. No, they say that's not what happens in the brain. They can also account for what is now called higher order cognition. What is higher order cognition? Higher order cognition is roughly cognition in which we do model, right? So you can, we do, of course, model. I'm actually engaged in modeling my book, which is blurred here. By speaking, I am inter alia modeling. We can model with maps. We can model with pictures. We can model in all kinds of ways. But the nice and consistent, the only way in which these thinkers can have a consistent view of modeling, I think, is to see it as a kind of adaptation to a normative social space, a space in which norms for modeling happening, without these norms being modeled themselves. That's only consistent with the previous slide, okay? If you think you can act intelligently in the outside world and adapt to its structure without replicating that structure inside, well, you have to be consistent, also think in that way about dealing with the normative structure of modeling practices. Also there, you can follow the structure, act intelligently, adapted to the norms without modeling those norms, without being driven by a model of those norms. Okay, so you can navigate normative spaces without a model, a navigational model. Right, and now you can think, for example, now you can think again about imagining a centaur. Why do we imagine a centaur? Well, we can engage in imagining practices, and we don't, and we can do so without having a model of those practices themselves. We can, and these activities can include the visualization of a centaur, but the visualization is just an activity inside that larger activity, which is structured according to certain norms. Okay, very quickly, was that the past? This is like the 6 first chapters of the 6, perhaps 7, 8 also, from 9, 10, 11 in the book. Current forms of e-cognition are dealt with. 8 and 9 deal with current versions of the traditional view, and the 3 last chapters, 4 last chapters, if you want to include the short conclusion, they deal with current, what I call radical e-cognition, which is kind of cognition which is really in tension with the received view, which is embodied and active and culturated, what have you. And I think you can show that it's continuous with the people that I just talked about, but of course it also adds new stuff. James Gibson is one of them, Ecological Psychology. If you read Gibson, well, you can you'll be, and you have read, you'll be surprised by how parallel they are thinking. Okay, so the example of the table which Reed gives to refute Hume, well, it's sort of the blueprint for the general approach to visual perception. A lot of the visual approach to visual perception and perception in general, which you find in Gibson. You create patterns through your relations with an ambient optic array, with the totality of the stimulation, by moving through that ambient array, your relation constantly changes, and you have sensitivity to those changing patterns, and thereby you find out perceptually about the visual world. Very much in line with what Reed said about perceiving a table. Very much in line with what Dewey says about the historical fallacy. Gibson said behavior can be regular without being regulated. Okay, you have intelligence, sensitivity to structure, which doesn't need to rely on a sort of pushing rendering of that structure inside. Taylor and Smith's dynamical explanation of infant reaching is another fine example, I think, within dynamical systems theory, which is in its radical form, a form of what Chimero has called radical embodied cognitive science, which is an alternative to the modeling, representational, computational tradition. Well, if you read their well-known account of infant reaching, you'll see, I think, how it very nicely goes along the lines of Deweyan thinking, which tries to avoid falling into the reification historical fallacy. So the child comes to reach for an object that was hidden in its view. First, the child will reach wrongly, but then it will reach not for where the object is hidden, but for where it reached before, for example. But then it does correctly. Well, how does it come? Well, not because knowledge suddenly becomes active and drives the thing. No, because of a balance is found between a whole set of disparate processes which finally come into equilibrium, and then the knowledge is created as a product. It's not that a knowledge is in a reifying way seen as a cause. Okay, I'm almost there. And activists on language are another example which I give in the book on how the kind of thinking is continuous with this tradition that I sketched. Di Paolo Cuffari di Jager, linguistic bodies. There's quite some attention to that work in my book. I also refer to the work by Hutto and Myin, myself, of course, in radicalizing activism. And I think these stories give you a nice gradualistic, a broadly gradualistic story about emergence of language, in which you get the structure of language emerging out of developments which become increasingly social and increasingly language-like. What is, well, a nice notion which I found in Di Paolo and is that of social acts. A social act is like a handshake. It's an intrinsically social act. Like if I put out my hand, it needs a response to become a handshake. It needs a response by another actor who gives the complementary handshake. So in my reaching out, there's already this sociality inbuilt, and there's a normativity to it, because there's various ways to give a handshake, and you'd have to respond appropriately in order to fit the right rules for handshaking. Okay, according to these stories, these approaches, grammar and truth evaluability, grammar, the complex structure we find in language, and the truth evaluability of language, the fact that language can be some parts of language can be evaluated for truth. Like when I say it's raining, I'm saying something that can be evaluated for truth, and that therefore has a truth evaluable content. Well, according to these stories by both the linguistic body crew and the Hutto and Myin people, according to them, you have to see these structures as results, as achievements. They form in a complex constellation of conditions rather than you should take them as some kind of primitive which derive from some model for themselves. And if you do that, I think, and if you give enough detail, you sort of do away with this one big part of the problem space, the problem of intentionality. That's what's on the cognition side. Almost there. I didn't say much now about the hard consciousness and the so-called hard problem of consciousness. I have there's stuff about that in the book. And I think I can give good reasons which are present in the literature and which were already present for ages in the literature for resisting the idea that there is a hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, there are good arguments to say that it can be partly dissolved. And one of those, the reasons to say, one of several, why it can be partly dissolved is because a lot of motivation for a hard problem of consciousness comes from a view of experience as a kind of knowledge. There's this view present in Jackson's Mary argument very clearly of experience as giving you knowledge of subjective facts. But that's a very problematic view of experience. It's not necessary to equate experience and knowledge. And that was already known by, here he is again, Thomas Reid. He says, every man agrees that to suffer pain and to think of it are things which totally differ in kind. Yeah, the one thing is knowledge, the other not. None. You're related to pain in totally different ways, and a lot of the motivation for there being a hard problem of consciousness comes in not regarding or not seeing this difference in relation to pain, which Reid here points attention to. What is not, is everything about consciousness dissolvable? I don't know, but a lot of consciousness can become understandable, and I agree with enactivists here, with enactivists a la Di Paolo Thompson, that a theory of life, insights about the science of biology, insights about how life is organized and evolves and diversifies, can give you a greater understanding on consciousness. And again, we can see a precedent in Reid where he says, but the mind is from its very nature a living and active being. Everything we know of it implies life and active energy. Good. Finally, there's a lot of science in the book which I quote, which comes from philosophers or is associated with non-representation, non-computational, embodied theorizing, but not all of it. And I think there is a contemporary branch of science, which is very much useful and very much giving insights which are supporting the embodied and active cognition as an achievement case, and that's the science of cultural evolution. If I'm right, and I'm writing on it currently, cultural evolution shows us, and I think of the work of Henrik, for example, and of Lala, shows us the specificity of specifying, shows us how our very specific evolutionary pathways give us a very special capacity to have contentful specifying descriptive thoughts. We have a capacity for specifying that is very unique, but which can be traced back to a unique developmental history. And that's important because it shows that a general attitude in the different tradition, the different kind of mind tradition, namely the resistance to ascribing a capacity to represent universally to brains, even to animal brains, that it should be rethought. So here I found, outside of the usual suspect literature, I find confirmation for being what I call of a different mind. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Erik, for the presentation, for the nice presentation, also for the book, very interesting. And with many topics in history of philosophy, Western philosophy, and also philosophy of psychology and philosophy of mind, and different traditions in cognitive science as well. I was thinking maybe two questions now, Erik, and then maybe you can do a little pause for Cesar presentations.
Yeah.
The first one is more clarificatory, and the other one is more conceptual, philosophically. The first one, I didn't quite understand, both from your presentation and the book. Why do you need the concept of mediationism, and why not just representationalism? Why do you need a new concept or a different concept? And it was what is, because I have the sense when you talk about mediation, is just another name for representationalism, and then but we have already a big ongoing tradition, anti-representational tradition, and many things that you say about or against mediational relations are okay for. So to put it simple, I didn't quite understand why you need a new concept and not just representationalism will do the work for you. And the second one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
Is, I do not recall you talking about inferentialism in your book. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, but my point is not inferentialism, but inference. We'll come back to these discussions later on. But I would like to stress something, because the notion of direct perception is very important for your account. You know? The direct perception of the environment and this interaction between organism and the environment. I totally buy the idea that we do not really need mediation or representations for accommodating this navigation of the organism in the environment. But I would like to stress a little bit the notion of inference, not inferentialism, the kind of philosophical tradition, but why do we need inference for this direct perception? What should we need? Or I would like to think about it with you a little bit, because the environment, the direct perception of something, environment is structured. You said that sometimes in your presentations, and also your examples are examples of direct perception of structured external world. I have a cat here, and she's kind of singing. She's vocalizing with your presentation. So we need, maybe we need the inference because this environment, where the organism or the animal is, or human beings are, is structured. It's organized in a sense. Yeah. Take a look at your examples that you gave. So we do not need, I'm not saying inner modeling. I'm not saying a kind of model to navigate the world, but how we can navigate direct perceptions of a structured world. It's not just an object, but the object organized, relationally organized, in a sense that if your examples, if somebody is running or an animal is running, it's moving. If it's running, it's moving. If it's moving, it's not standing still. It's not paralyzed. So we have a kind of negation of if it's running, it's not paralyzed. You see, and it's through and through animal that it would be very weird that an animal does not perceive another animal if it's moving. It's not paralyzed. Yeah? If it's paralyzed, it's not moving. And this kind of structure perception as well, and direct structure perception, and also, for instance, the self-perception as well is structure. In a sense, if I feel pain on my arm, the pain is not on my foot. Yeah? I will not show my foot to a doctor if my pain is on my arm, in my arm. So my self-perception, my direct self-perception is also structured, relationally structured. And there is some sort of negation there operate. I'm not saying about the inner modeling, you see? I'm saying that, and also another example that you gave, of the flame. And this can be very naturalizable in a sense. If an animal, if there is a flame there is some fire, this fire is not cold. If there is some fire, if it's hot, it's not cold. If it's hot, I will not approach it in the same way that I would approach if it would be as another intensity. And there is some degrees of intensity of the how hot the fire is, you see? And this is structured as well. So maybe I would like to hear more about that. It's not just direct perception, but it's direct perception of something structured.
Yeah.
Maybe conceptually structured or inferentially concept. I don't know what the kind of concept that you, or philosophical notion you want. Yeah? But how do you deal with the structure environment? And it's pretty much naturalizable. It's not just human. It's not modeling. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very, very much. I have a lot to say about the second. The first one, yeah. Well, why mediationism? Because one reason to talk about mediationism is that, listen, the word representation also is used in a relatively specific way nowadays, and it's used also for Locke and Hume, for example. Yeah, I know it is used for them, but then I was a bit hesitant to just deal with them only under that umbrella, because it would seem as if they were saying exactly the same things as people say now. And their motivation for their views is often this mediationism. You don't see the world directly, but you see it as mediated. It was in the Hume quote. There's a Locke quote, and many more of them, but one which I often use, which is in the book also, in which it's this mediationism. But it's of course, this mediation is a kind of representationalism in them, yeah. But it's mainly because of their own motivation. And I didn't wanna write whole paragraphs about how the sense of representation was different with them, etc. Because I don't want to go into those historical, being right in a historical way, but destroying your text because of it. I didn't want to let that happen. Is that sufficient? Yeah. I know. I can feel the problem, and I struggled it a little bit, but I think it won't hurt the reader too much, I think. And then for inferentialism, inference. Yeah, I'll talk about it more in the reaction of your talk, but basically, and I'll explain it there. Basically, I totally agree with you that you have sensitivity to relations, and a very complex sensitivity to relations in animals, even in simple animals. But I want to refrain from calling that sensitivity always inferential, So I think you can be sensitive to all kinds of relations. Even like in Pavlovian conditioning, you're sensitive to relations, right? But you're not making inferences. I want to restrict the use of the word inference to when descriptions are used. So you have an inference when you combine premises to draw a conclusion. And the fun thing, of course, is that if your reasoning is sound, if your premises are true, you are, by inferential reasoning in the descriptive sense, you're also sensitive to relations which you could perhaps be sensitive to without the inferential reasoning, right? But still, I think capacity, when you have the capacity to describe, as we have the capacity for specifying, there is a change also in the way in which you can be sensitive to relations.
We're gonna come back to this. We have problems.
That's what I want to work on now, because I think it's very important. Yeah.
If reasoning, just when you have descriptions, you're gonna lose the possibility that animals and complex animals, as primates, they reason. They do not reason.
Well, they can't even reason, but I want to restrict inference to combining descriptions.
Yeah.
And you can have you can have thoughts, you can have intelligence, sensitivity to relations which connect to each other. You can have all of that, but not descriptions.
But then you come back to the distinction between reasoning and inference.
Yeah.
So we're gonna back to this.
Yep.
This morning, of course.
Yeah.
So, but I would like to say that pre-linguistical children and also complex animals, they infer and also they reason, even without a full-blood organized linguistic competences. So, but we're gonna come back to this, and we have 2 questions here for the chat for the YouTube. Thank you very much. Maybe we can do the 2 together, Erik, and then we do a short pause before Cesar
that's good.
presentations. Okay. The first one comes from Miguel, and thank you, Miguel, for the question. Miguel says, philosophers have started to pay attention to internal phenomena like inner speech, mind wandering, mental imagery. What historical philosophical outlook can we get to explain them from your view? And the second point is maybe comes close to the first question by Miguel, is another question made by Pedro. Pedro said, raised the question here, could you elaborate a bit more on the relation between activism and the hard problem of consciousness? In what way could it help solve the problem? That wasn't entirely clear to me. Okay, and they are kind of connected. Thank you, Miguel and Pedro.
Okay, the first one, that's a very interesting topic in which I want to work also again. You have this inner speech, these inner life things. I think there is a way to think about inner speech, inner imagery, a traditional way which connects to the cognitivist computational representational view, in which inner speech, inner imagery, it's a matter of internalization, as it's called, right? That's often the word that's used, and it's as if the thing that could be done externally is now done internally, but then you have some kind of replica of the external thing going on purely mentally. That's the kind of descriptions you have, and I think that's problematic for all kinds of reasons. But it's difficult to get rid of and to get an alternative. But I think there are the route to an alternative, and route to an alternative is Yeah. I can only be general about it, but it's applying what I said. I think you can in inner speech, you don't, I think the right way to think about it, and there's much more which I should say and I cannot yet say, I think, but wait a few years. The good way is not to think of this as replicating the structure, but being so familiar with the external structure that you have a grip on it, and that you can maneuver in it, sense its possibilities without reproducing them. Okay, like a jazz musician in a who is improvising can, I think, if the jazz musician is very good, can do a move which will pay off many notes later, just because of this enormous sensitivity that the musician has to how the whole thing unfolds. But you can have this sensitivity without having to have the whole thing unfold. And that's the kind of anticipation of virtualities, which is really very essential to cognition, and certainly the internalized. Well, not only the internalized kind, but to get a real grip on it, you need to get rid of this internalization, the replication of the thing. Okay, you can be sensitive to something virtual without you having to picture the virtual thing. Just and that is due to the musician's grasp of the fact that this is an expert. Okay, you're an expert in it. Yeah, it's also the way in which we are experts in speaking. That's slightly vague, but it's where the truth lies, I think. Shall I go to the second one? If that's enactivism and the hard problem of consciousness. Okay. I think basically, for me, the enactive view of consciousness is, and I don't know if I'm talking only for myself or for other enactors. And actually, if you enact, basically, well, consciousness is just being that kind of living system with that special structure, and you don't. There are no extra facts that are generated when you are this kind of system, but just being materially identical, I don't know what, or being this kind of system that has this kind of structure, engaging in its activity, that is being conscious. There are no subjective facts that are generated out of the objective world or so. It's just that's what consciousness is, and activism by well, the autopoietic mind life continuity form, just by specifying which kinds of conditions give you that kind of structure, being which gives you consciousness, you elucidate consciousness. Yeah, that's basically what there is to say, and that's as near as you can come to explaining consciousness as you can. Well, and there's a lot of conceptual confusion in the idea that there is a hard problem of consciousness, namely something which should be explained by science but can't be explained by current science. I think that's an illusion. What so to say there's no even a clear idea of what it would take to solve the hard problem of consciousness, just because it's what what needs to be explained is unspecified. And solving the problem, the solution which I showed, is very simple. This hard problem of consciousness, as it is set up by the knowledge argument, is all about knowledge of this subjective fact. As if when Mary gets out of the room, she learns to know something. But that's not the only possible way in which you can describe what happens when she goes out of the room. You can just say she experiences something. And to experience something is not to know something. You can experience something. Perhaps animals have all kinds of experience which they don't know. And read correctly points to the difference between knowing about pain and feeling pain, right? Of course, we as creatures that are verbal and that are reflective all the time, we add a lot of knowledge to experience, and our experience is embedded in our knowing life, and our knowing life is embedded in our experiential life. But to see experience as a kind of as access to or a kind of knowledge implies that you have access to some kind of known thing, but that again is reifying the object of experience into something which you have access to. These are all conceptual presuppositions, I think, which go with the construction of there being a hard problem of consciousness. And the inactive alternative is to say consciousness is just about being a living creature. It's not accessing an object, it's just having that structure, being alive, and leading that life. Very simply said, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Erik, for the presentation and for the answers to the questions now. We're going to do a short pause,
Yeah.
or maybe a coffee, a toilet, and then it's 10:24 for me here. Maybe you can come back in 20:30. No,
Yep.
sorry, 10:30.
Yeah.
10:30, so for the presentation of Cesar. Okay, Cesar, okay, Erik? Okay.
Thank you.
We'll come back in 6 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Okay, shall we start? Bruno, if you already can. Okay. Thank you. I would like to thank Bruno Luiz, which is a student of ours here in Recife, who is working on the backstage of this presentation. And it's very important to have this kind of support. Yeah. And talking about support, thank you, Cesar Meurer, which is a good friend of ours in Brazil, for your time and for your supporting for Brazilian Society of Analytical Philosophy and also our group here in Recife. I'm looking forward to having you here in Recife in July as well. And Cesar will present some thoughts on Myin's view of recursion. Thank you very much, Cesar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure. Thank you, Erik, for your very interesting book. I think it's no shame to say that I did not read it completely as of now. It's just been published, and there was a PDF made available to me. I had that PDF to prepare my contribution. So let's get right into it, okay? To begin with, a context for the issues surrounding linguistic recursion. So for decades, the theoretical landscape surrounding recursion has been defined by the Chomskyan paradigm. It became standard practice to use it as a contrast for the development and discussion of alternatives. As a quick recap of the Chomskyan stance, I would recall the following. Over 2 decades ago, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch famously divided the language faculty into broad and narrow senses and stressed that the narrow sense, I quote, only includes recursion, and it is the only uniquely human component of the faculty of language, end of quote. In the 90s, Chomsky had already proposed that our synthetic engine is fundamentally based on a cognitive operation called merge, which basically combines 2 lexical items or synthetic objects into a new one. This operation enables recursion because its outputs can be repeatedly remerged, generating structures of unbounded complexity. More recently, in a book titled Why Only Us?, merge is defined as, I quote, the simplest possible mode of recursive generation, end of quote. And then a controversial reasoning about its origins is presented. If merge is minimal, it is an all or nothing thing. In other words, there is no half merge or partial recursion in the evolution of syntax. So there must have been an evolutionary leap that enabled us humans to perform merge. And just to finish this quick recap, we can trace this back to Chomsky's early publications in the 50s and the 60s and highlight that his critique of behaviorism and structuralism was grounded in their failure to explain the creative and productive character of linguistic competence. In those books, the term recursion was not prominent. The prominent terms were creativity and productivity, but I think he was sure reflecting about the underlying mechanism that explains how creativity and productivity happen. In recent decades, a number of researchers have sought to establish a tenable non-Chomskyan framework for understanding recursion. One notable example is Everett. Everett claims to have found that the Piraão people in the Brazilian Amazon speak a language that completely lacks recursive structures. Piraão, I quote, is the only language known without embedding, end of quote. Everett's findings challenge the idea that recursion is a universal foundation of human language. Another notable example is Tomazello's rejection of the existence of a specialized recursion module in the brain. Tomasello's view is often termed the usage-based view because he holds that humans use general cognitive abilities to string words together, and that cultures conventionalize some combinations into grammatical structures. Along Tomasello's lines, recursion is reconceived as an emergent property of general intelligence and culture. Yet another interesting development is the post-cognitivist movement you talked about just a minute ago. This movement has grown around the idea that, this is Varela, Thompson, and Rush, cognition is not the representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but is rather the enactment of a world and a mind on the basis of a history of the variety of actions that a being in the world performs. End of quote. This is such a beautiful passage. I use it all the time. In broad lines, post-cognitivists like you, Erik, conceive language as constitutively social, as a social-cultural practice that is not primarily a matter of representing the world, but of interacting and coordinating with others. In Of a Different Mind, you offered thoughtful contributions to a variety of topics that are on the post-cognitivist agenda, as we just saw. And one of them is a view of recursion, which is conceived as a feature that emerges organically from complex social actions such as dialogic reporting and interactive coordination. Here's a quote. As dialogic interactions develop and diversify, structures recognizable as grammatical emerge. With an utterance that contains an utterance, recursion has emerged. Recursion concerns the nested structure of language, allowing, among other things, for sentences that contain sentences as part of them. Crucially, in the enactive story, recursion forms first in the structure of actions. When participant B produces an utterance that recaptures and comments on A's utterance, the recursive structure is in B's reporting. It is B's act that recaptures A's act. Recursion follows naturally from the way that interactions complexify. End of quote. And you see I'm quoting it from the PDF that was made available to me. So your post-cognitivist effort to ground something as intricate as recursion entirely within the domain of social action leaves some questions unanswered. Relocating language from the brain to the social sphere is a major shift, and it remains incomplete and perhaps unconvincing until a full-fledged account of recursion is presented. In the absence of such an account, I believe it begins to resemble earlier structuralist and behaviorist approaches, which were criticized, as I mentioned a minute ago, precisely for failing to explain the generative and recursive dimensions of language. So my talk aims at contributing to the development of your view of recursion. I will suggest that it can be improved by addressing three distinct challenges or three distinct hurdles: a mechanistic one, a phylogenetic one, and a cognitive economic one. So in the remaining the time, I will just explore these hurdles and suggest or speculate how a post-cognitivist might address them. So the first challenge, or the mechanistic hurdle, has to do with center embedding and working memory. You conceive recursion as rooted in the act of reporting and utterance. It can be my own utterance or someone else's, as in, quote, you said we weren't going to talk about the weather. That's your example in the book. So my point, this is sound insofar as the explanandum is right-branching recursion. But it needs further development regarding other forms of recursion. So recursion manifests itself in a variety of forms. A standard classification distinguishes between right branching, where recursive embedding proceeds rightward, left branching, where embedding proceeds leftward, and center embedding, where recursive material is nested within the middle of a construction. From a different perspective, one can also distinguish between direct recursion, when a category embeds another instance of itself, and indirect recursion, when recursion loops through intermediate categories before returning to the original category type. Still, from a different perspective, one may distinguish between subclausal recursion, when a phrasal category embeds another instance of itself without introducing a new verbal predicate, and clausal recursion, when an entire clause is embedded within another clause, introducing a new subject-predicate structure or event. So linguists are typically saying that these different forms of recursion may require different explanations. Center embedding poses by far the greatest challenge to non-Chomskyan accounts. It is no coincidence that the Chomskyan tradition highlights it as evidence that language cannot be a mere byproduct of social habits. Consider the example I presented in the previous slide. The rat that the cat, the dog chased, bit, ate the cheese. I left it in different colors so you see better the dependencies. To produce this structure, a speaker must initiate a sequence, the rat, temporarily suspend it in order to initiate an embedded sequence, that the cat, suspend that sequence in turn to initiate yet another sequence, that the dog chased, and then successfully recover the previously suspended dependencies. Try using center embedding in a real-life conversation. You will agree that such nesting places heavy demands on working memory, as multiple unresolved dependencies must be actively maintained throughout the utterance. When considered independently of memory constraints, the capacity for center embedding appears to be unbounded. In other words, the nesting process can in principle be expanded to any depth without becoming ungrammatical. So what could plausibly underlie such capacity? For Chomsky, our brain comes with a hardwired recursive synthetical engine capable of embedding phrase structures ad infinitum, even if our biological limitations restrict everyday usage. This is the competence-performance distinction. It's a kind of intriguing epistemological stance in place at least since the 60s. At the beginning of a book titled Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, Chomsky says, and I quote, "Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interests, and errors in applying his knowledge of the language in actual performance." End of quote. So, how could Myin's socially grounded framework account for center embedding? I wonder in which sense center embedding follows naturally from the way that interactions complexify. It's not clear how the interactive rhythm of dialogical reporting scales up to suspended nested architectures. The issue here is not to explain extremely complex structures of the sort an ideal speaker might in principle produce and understand. Instead, the challenge is to explain the ordinary human capacity to nest 2 or 3 constituents within a construction. Humans do so, despite the limitations of memory, distractions, shifts of attention, interests, errors, etc. So let's speculate a bit. To address the challenge of center embedding from a post-cognitivist perspective, one should avoid getting trapped in the cognition first cycle of explaining cognitive activity in terms of antecedent cognitive activity. Very much in the sense you mentioned that in your previous presentation, right? So, You could perhaps leverage the concepts of material scaffolding, this idea that human cognition is environmentally supported, and cognitive technology, and argue that nested structures are culturally engineered tools or epistemic artifacts. You state that the use of objects, and I quote, expands and transforms cognitive capacities. That's a passage of your book. So along the same line, maybe spoken and written words can be conceived as external objects that become targets of attention. As such, they actively give shape to complex thought. I don't know if this move is sound, but if it's sound, then we reach the view on which recursive thought is a developmental product of language use in the world and not its antecedent. This seems in line with another emphasis I found in your book that says, and I quote, abstraction is acquired. It's a product of a history of interactions rather than a basis, end quote. Pushing this ahead, you might argue that the ability to parse center-embedded clauses is an acquired product of interactive history rather than an innate computational mechanism. And as for the working memory demands of such structures, a post-cognitivist will avoid the assumption that cognition occurs solely within the brain, right? Consequently, if language is truly a collective achievement forged across bodies, social groups, and external artifacts, then maybe the cognitive load could be seen as distributed across these domains or these dimensions. The second challenge, I call it the phylogenetic hurdle. It has to do with hierarchical action in primates and recursion. So, as we saw in the long quote, Myin seeks to ground recursion in the structure of complex actions and interactive coordination, proposing that syntax emerges from the shared domain of interpersonal deeds. This action first account encounters a comparative biological challenge when evaluated in regard to close evolutionary relatives such as chimpanzees and bonobos. The point is, these non-human primates have complex social lives and execute multi-tiered nested action sequences. Nonetheless, they show no spontaneous capacity to generate or comprehend recursively nested syntax. The limitations of non-human primates with respect to recursion are well documented by Chomsky linguists. In a book titled The Evolution of Language, Fitch highlights a disconnection between what non-human primates can do and what they can communicate. Drawing on empirical literature, he demonstrates that the cognitive architecture required to process complex hierarchical structures is present in primate cognition. And primates deploy this machinery in non-communicative domains such as navigating intricate social networks, executing multi-step forwarding strategies, and utilizing tools. So the point is, if hierarchical processing exists for motor and social tasks, why is it absent in communication? Fitch attributes this gap to the strongly domain-specific nature of primate cognition. In sum, their syntax of action is not neurologically integrated with their communication system, preventing them from deploying those same hierarchical principles in the construction of recursive vocalizations or gestures. Lab studies further corroborate this functional discontinuity. So, since both intense sociality and nested tool use are shared by all primates, social complexification alone seems insufficient to explain why recursion crossed into language for only one species. So you claim that recursion follows naturally from the way that interactions complexify. Remains tenable only if it can explain why the transition from intense sociality and hierarchical action to recursive syntax occurred exclusively in the human lineage. So, one way of addressing this challenge consists in shifting the focus from the mere presence of social complexity to the specific nature of human cultural transmission. No doubt non-human primates possess sophisticated social intelligence, but their cognitive power is characterized by individual intentionality, which evolved primarily to navigate complex and often competitive social matrices. Consequently, maybe you could argue that the lack of the specific psychological infrastructure of shared intention, they lack that specific psychological infrastructure of shared intentionality. I take this from Tomasello. I think Tomasello had this in mind when he put forward his shared intentionality hypothesis, that human cognition evolved as an adaptation for, I quote, dealing with problems of social coordination, specifically problems presented by individuals' attempts to collaborate and communicate with others, to cooperate with others. End quote. The key idea would be that at some point humans began to coordinate their actions and intentional states in ways that non-human primates simply do not. Although their interactions are highly sophisticated, they function as parallel co-actions driven by individual goals rather than true collaboration. They observe and emulate, but ultimately rely on a self-focused cognition. As Tomasello puts it, I quote, "Great apes were all about cognition for competition," end quote. Which means they failed to actively teach and establish joint goals or coordinate individual roles within a shared framework. So consequently, you could contend that recursion is uniquely human not because other primates lack social lives, but because only human communities develop these specific ultra-social joint attentional practices required to capture and report an action within an action. You could argue that this evolutionary pressure of cooperative communication transformed that latent motor capacity into an active synthetic reality. This is speculative. The third challenge, I call it the cognitive economy hurdle, has to do with chunking and intellectualizing. And it points to a kind of a curious situation. Let's frame it like this. By trying to avoid the heavy intellectual machinery of cognitivism, Myin actually risks overcomplicating the nature of everyday social interactions. The point is, if you argue that recursion emerges when an utterance contains an utterance, you say just that, with an utterance that contains an utterance, recursion has emerged, then you seem to be assuming that daily dialogue has indeed a nested structural logic. And this assumption can be criticized as a theoretical idealization. In a book titled The Written Language Bias in Linguistics, Per Limel, I think it's Swedish, argues that mainstream linguistics and language sciences are shaped by a written language bias, a situation he regards as paradoxical. I quote, "There is an almost unanimous agreement on the absolute primacy of spoken language, Yet language is explored from theoretical and methodological point of departure that are ultimately derived from concerns with cultivating, standardizing, and teaching forms of written language. End of quote. So, what modern linguistics usually defines as structure, I quote Lino again, has been conceived in ways that are strongly influenced by considerations of written as opposed to spoken interactional language. And this, as Lino sees it, induces reification. I quote again, "The units and rules of a generative grammar are nothing but abstractions, ways of stating structural relations between substantial linguistic phenomena, but once explicitly formulated, such abstractions easily become reified, looked upon as abstract things." In an influential paper on language diversity, Evans and Levinson make a similar point, which they classify as a widespread misconception. I quote the misconception. Misconception is that the differences between languages are merely superficial and that they can be resolved by postulating a more abstract formal level at which individual language differences disappear. End of quote. So, current insights from language acquisition and statistical learning suggest that speech production prioritizes cognitive economy, kind of an online strategy to minimize processing effort. Instead of producing utterances through complex hierarchical nesting, speakers rely on linear automated habits. In spontaneous speech, clauses that appear recursive from a written perspective, such as "I think that X, you said that Y," function as flat formulaic templates. Speakers deploy these expressions as prefabricated prefixes or epistemic markers. This real-time chaining is often called chunking and described as highly efficient from the cognitive economic perspective. I quote YB. In language, chunking is basic to the formation of sequential units expressed as constructions, constituents, and formulaic expressions. Repeated sequences of words or morphemes are packed together in cognition so that the sequence can be accessed as a single unit, and that's the economy. So, consequently, the apparent structural depth of spoken language is largely an illusion generated by a persistent written language bias. That's right. Then, to a significant extent, fluent speech is not an intricate tree structure, but a rapid linear sequencing of highly automated multi-word chunks. This reliance on cognitive economy challenges the social genealogy of recursion. If interpersonal interactions are negotiated through routinized shortcuts designed to minimize processing effort, then social dialogue may not provide the deep recursive scaffolding Myin posits. By assuming that dialogue naturally possesses formal synthetic properties, Myin kind of inherits the formalist bias he opposes, merely relocating idealized three structures from the individual brain to the social space. So, to handle this critique, and here I'm going speculative again, Myin might reframe chunking as the sedimentation of recursion rather than its alternative. He could argue that while everyday performance relies on flat chunks for real-time cognitive economy, these shortcuts are the downstream products of structurally deep dialogic innovations. The idea is to distinguish synchronic processing economy from diachronic structural origins. On this basis, one could argue that over time, complex recursive interactions became conventionalized and compressed into easily retrievable templates. So recursion remains the constitutive foundation of communication, even if our real-time cognitive ecology relies on habit-based shortcuts. A few concluding remarks. The first one, moving the basis of syntax out of the mind and into everyday social dialogue is an ambitious step that requires resolving some hurdles, some challenges, presented them as the mechanistic, the phylogenetic, and the cognitive economic challenge. As I have shown, a non-Chomsky approach requires more than changing the locus of recursion. To be tenable, it needs to explain how the messy real-time dynamics of human engagement can generate the nested architectures characteristic of human language. These suggested directions for developing your view, Erik, are obviously underdeveloped and open to significant controversy. For instance, borrowing Tomasello's shared intentionality hypothesis creates a clash, since it relies on the very internalist representationalist ideas that you've been rejecting for many years. Furthermore, invoking material scaffolding to address the working memory demands of center embedding remains incomplete, speculative, without an explanation of how words, by all means fleeting acoustic signals, can function as stable external epistemic artifacts. And finally, attempting to resolve the cognitive economy hurdle by reframing flat automated chunks as the diachronic downstream products of historical recursion creates sort of a tension, because it seems to threaten to dilute your core claim that recursive structure is actively and directly present within the immediate live act of dialogic report. So these are just some of the controversial points, and I highlight them as an invitation for you to develop and eventually clarify your stance. By pointing out these unresolved issues, I hope to prompt you to sort of sharpen concepts and boundaries regarding linguistic recursion. It'd be interesting to see how you handle all this, whether by entirely stripping representation from shared intentionality, explaining how spoken words can act as lasting material anchors, or finding a totally different and active way to square real-time processing limits with complex grammar. To conclude, I think your account of recursion will solidify into a viable non-Chomsky alternative if it succeeds in reconciling the inactive reality of everyday communication with the structural demands of complex syntax. That's all I've got. Thank you for your attention.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I need my slides, yeah? Thank you very much. Thank you. No, yeah. Good. Thank you very much for your excellent little paper, which I got yesterday, just before I went to sleep. There's a time difference here. Yeah. You raise you point out potential problems, and you really these are not trivial or these are very well reflected upon issues. But you're so kind to package possible answers into it too. So it's like the problems are there, but how it could be solved is also there. Okay, but let me react. And this is like, as they say in, I think, American English, this is a bit shooting from the hip, because I've seen the details only very recently, and now you nicely presented the paper as I received it. Let me give you some quick shoot from the hip reactions. Well, shoot from the hip, I said immediate, or relatively immediate reactions. And thank you again. I really was impressed by your piece of work. Let me first remind you about the aims of my book. My book is an introduction to themes about thinking about the mind. It's not a monograph defending my specific position. It's an overview of different positions, which I sort of contrast with each other, but I also emphasize that within the contrast, both contrasted sides, there are many differences. Of course, I have the aim of telling the story about thinking about the mind from another side than the usual one. So I do have a kind of position or something that I want to promote. But what I want to do is not promoting specific theories, but presenting one picture against another picture, right? I say, here you have this traditional picture, or this cognition first picture, and here you have another picture. And in one of the other books, in the books with Dan Hutto, we say something, and I was reminded of it because Marcos talked about it when I saw him in Brazil the first time. We say philosophy is in the business of promoting possibilities, okay? Where philosophers say, you can't be this way, you have to see it this way. A philosopher can say, no, here's how you can see it differently. And that's sort of the kind of attitude, which the general attitude which I take in the book. Okay, so the evolution of recursion. It's quite brief, the paragraph, the part that I write on it, but it of course fits into this broader picture about the evolution of language, grammar, well, and even cognition and abstraction, as you mentioned. And I want to the picture that I want to replace, of course, is what's the cognition first picture. Language rests on language, grammar rests on grammar, recursion rests on recursion, which is the Chomskyan picture. You agree with that, I think. And you're relatively friendly. You're much more friendly to this picture, or much more inclined to take it much more seriously than I do, because I don't want to be too crude, but I think there really is a very, very long-standing unresolved problem with this picture. I don't think it is explanatory at all. If you make a deductive system, as a deductive system, it works. There is grammar, there is grammar in the brain, there is grammar in language. The grammar in language comes from. Therefore, you have language in that. Of course, that works. But how plausible are the axioms, right? And I think they're not plausible, but because they're not explanatory at all. If you have to assume some kind of unexplained language just being there. It's some kind of cognition just being there at the basis of all cognition. If you have to assume, I'm widening it now, if you have to assume the existence of abstraction mechanisms which you leave unexplained, you have not done nothing, I think. You have shown that if you could assume them, well, then you could explain everything that follows them, but the initial assumption is still standing. And perhaps you could push this attitude, or you could say that's not a real problem because we're the only kind of game in town. That's what Fodor does very explicitly in the language of thought. Well, it's not true. It's not the only game in town. And that's why all the Chomskyan arguments are always, you can't explain it, you can't explain it, we're the only way to explain. No, that's not true. And I'm not allowing them that attitude at all. Or only very minimally. Because I think there is a different picture. It's at least possible. Perhaps it's also plausible, but at least it's possible. And that's enough already to refute we're the only thinkable game in town. And the picture, the alternative picture, is a recursion as arising from earlier complexifications of interactions. In a broader way, perhaps, than in that citation. But still, that's a good instance of the different picture. Here you have recursion enabled by the process of some utterer of an utterance that plays the role of the hearer of the utterance, and adds or recaptures another utterance and embeds it in the own utterance. Okay, I've sort of mischaracterize it a little bit here, but you see the thing. Okay, so I was a bit rushed in making these slides. Okay, good. Let me now go. That's a global remark. Let me go to Cesar. How do I pronounce it? Cesar. That's it. That's
Kaiser.
Good. Cesar's point number one, the mechanistic hurdle. Here's the takeaway version. There are many forms of recursion, some of which don't fit the hearing oneself mode. And center embedding should be poignant example, of course, as a beautiful example of that. What is my reaction here? Well, first, reiterating the general point, my point with respect to recursion, which you cited, it's not meant to give in one paragraph the theory of recursion that covers all kinds of recursion, right? It's not meant to be that general, and it's even not meant to be that absolute even for a part of recursion. It's look there, that seems to offer something which at least gives counterweight to this. The only possibility lies elsewhere. But still, it might work partially. You say it could work for, or you say it works for tail recursion. Yeah, that's already enough to falsify the only game in town, the only game in town claim, right? Because if that were true, no form of recursion could be explained in any other way than the Chomskyan way. And even if, okay. Good. What about stuff like center embedding? Well, even if what I say is not right for center embedding, that doesn't mean at all that the cognition first view is right there. Because the problem which I pointed at, it's non-explanatory. And I think there remain many, many, many other possibilities, some of which you point at within the action first view of center embedding. I was just thinking while you were talking, you could this pausing of an action. I'm just wildly speculating now, but you could see it as having some roots in cooperation, in collaborative actions in which you pause an action you're doing to let another collaborator do something, and then you add your part again to the action. That could be some kind of pattern that could play a role in center embedding too, right? And you could see how it could emerge in a social sphere and then get reappear in a less social form. Perhaps. So there are many possibilities. Of course, there are center embedding. I don't know if it has been researched, but how well is center embedding connected to writing? Are all languages, do they all work with center embedding? Do languages that don't have a written version do they also work with center embedding? No, they don't. So it might be a product of writing, right? It might be possible, enabled by writing, which would, of course, very, very much fit the action first view, right? In many ways. It might be related to structures that have already earlier emerged in language, so that you even not considering the writing, right? You might have languages that develop this way and therefore have these possibilities, while other languages develop in another way and are forbidden or have closed possibilities by taking that route. There might be this kind of path dependency in language, right? But it's all these are very, very much empirical matters, I think. Empirical matters which I think are very important, but which get disregarded in the Chomskyan approach. Because there you have the a priori arguments and the structure which is there before the empirical process starts, so to say. Okay. So that's the first one, the mechanistic hurdle. Okay, the phylogenetic hurdle. Takeaway version that I distilled from it is that primates have complicated social interaction, but no recursive language. I totally agree with that, of course. So what's my answer? It's in line with what's made most explicit in chapter 6, which is called Difference, which is about Wittgenstein, Anskamp, Ryle, but it's the spirit of the whole book. Well, I try to always point out, well, the specifics matter very much. When thinking about a phenomenon, don't think about one example, or don't think you have the generic phenomenon, which you can think about in the abstract. No, think about something which can have many different shapes and which we might only understand if we cover enough of its varieties. So there might be specifics of a phenomenon. Hierarchical interaction, it's an abstraction, right? There are many ways, many things which we call hierarchical interactions. The word hierarchical interactions covers many different kinds of interaction. And they might differ, in ways which we might find out are empirically relevant for what further possibilities there are, right? If you have this kind of hierarchical, which only differs a little bit from this kind, you might have foreclosed some possibilities. And that might be perfectly the case. And that points to the following point, the specifics of the phenomenon's history. I've already said it sort of, but to emphasize it, a history might, like a person's history, makes the person into uniquely what the person is. A phenomenon's history, if you have this version of this version, might determine the possibilities. You might have path dependency, and I think that's. And I'll return to that perhaps. I think in this context of thinking about language, that's confirmed in contemporary signs of cultural evolution. You have from the literature which I read, which is mostly Joseph Henrich and Kevin Lala, they point at differences in social learning situations. It seems, learn in different way. We have different attitudes in learning situations from other animals that also have social learning situations, but ours differ. And from the differences, for example, we seem to be able to place greater trust in peers. We from these differences follows a capacity to have different kinds of products of your learning process, right? We might sort of it's just because of the trust we play in a teacher, we might be able to ingest much more without immediate gratification, right? And there might be specially evolved, this might be a specially evolved process or specially evolved attitudes which we have. And together, these differences might, and that's actually what these people writing on cultural evolution, what they aim for, this might explain why we have evolved language and they have not. Because of different cultures, different social constellations, which also occurred in different circumstances with different needs, etc., etc. So the bland idea or inference, there's social hierarchy. So if language comes from social hierarchy, why don't they have language? Should be refined, because what kind of social hierarchy and what kind of social interactions you have in these hierarchies might matter very much. Then to the Fitch view, well, I think that's an intellectualization, okay? Because it talks about this, it almost talks about the grammatical structure in action, which then doesn't get translated into language in them, but in ours does. Well, I don't think, and you make that point, and that will come in your third point. I would resist, despite what you say in your third point, I would resist calling motor organization already grammatical. It's an enabler, might be an enabler for grammar, but I certainly would not willingly commit to a kind of intellectualization that I see in Fitch, sorry. Okay. So I certainly agree that there is structure in action, but I don't think its explanation comes from abstract syntactic structure. I do think that there is much more, that there is potential in the kinds of explanations that are rejected completely and absolutely by the Chomskyan and Camp, which then includes Fitch. I think the idea, Skinner's idea of precurrent behavior is very fine. Precurrent behavior is activity that prepares for other activity, and his idea is that such activity could be indirectly reinforced in an evolutionary process. And you could have precurrent behavior, so you could have preparation for preparations. That seems to a way to account for evolutionarily acquired structured activities. Of course, there's much more that needs to be said there. Could Tomasello be agreed with? I think yes, for the phenomena he refers to, but not necessarily for the theoretical framework which he pushes on the phenomena. I don't know, this distinction is always important. It's like an activism or the kind of radical embodied, or what you want to call it, thinking doesn't reject things like inference or imagination or complex cognition. It doesn't reject the existence of it. It rejects a certain way of conceiving of that, right? And it's not unable. It's not saying that belief doesn't exist. It says that belief, as understood by cognitivists, does not exist, but belief in itself can, if it can be given an embodied, radically embodied story, can fit perfectly well in explanation. And that's the way I think radical embodied and active cognition should go, and does go in a lot of cases. So specifying or going to the topic of representation, because Cesar, was it that? No, I'm saying, yeah. Talks about the representational framework in which the ideas on social cooperation by Tomasello are framed. Well, I can even give a role to representation if it's. I certainly don't want to reject blandly that in our social cooperation, representation doesn't play a role. No, I think the fact that we are representers does play a significant role in our social cooperation. Okay, we can represent. I'm representing all the time by uttering sentences. It's just that representation doesn't have to be thought of as mental representations that drive my activity. Representation is itself an activity, but being able to engage in that activity might and does color or shape all my other activities, right? But it needn't do that by instantaneous representing on the spot in every case in which it has an influence. That's the idea. That's the navigating a normative space without modeling that normative space. Okay, point 3, intellectualizing and chunking. Here's the takeaway version. If recursion is already in the self-hearing attitude, well, that's the way I now describe how I describe it. And isn't this committing to a recursion first view? In fact, recursion might be an idealization only. Non-recursive chunking might be what's in actual speech, right? Again, here's my answer. Again, my approach is one of contrasting pictures. Against a traditional picture, I want to push the point that another picture is possible and more plausible. It's more plausible because it doesn't have this infinite regress problem, this unexplained explainer problem. To avoid the intellectualization which you mentioned and which I attributed, or which I found in Fitch, I think it suffices for me to point out that the precondition, what's present in the social interaction, or it just enables what follows without completely prefiguring it, right? That suffices, I think, and that goes for possible structure in motor actions too. Concerning chunking, that I found a difficult point because it was relatively technical, and it was well, technical. It was a bit brief sometimes for me. I'm not familiar enough with that literature. I just have these 2 points. Well, if there indeed is less recursion, that's no problem for me. Because, as you say, recursion is seen as a centerpiece of the arguments against the kind of view that I want to present. So the phenomenon would if its status would be less firm than assumed by my enemies, all the better for me. But that's sort of that's a very quick one. I realize that, but still. Now, on the other hand, if there is recursion, I think, as I said at the beginning, and this is closing the circle, there are many, 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 many possibilities. I haven't given a firm theory, but already what I've given, and I must absolutely say, in addition, your speculation, they open a wide variety of possibilities for the kind of view which I think is on the right track. And I think that the other view, which say that it must be on the right track, because according to it, my view can't be on the right track. Well, I think that can't be on the right track. Do I still have one? No, that's it. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Amazing. Some very fine distinctions. I would have a number of reactions, but I think we should eventually open up for the audience, or see if we are running on time. I'm happy this is being recorded, Erik and Marcus, so I can come back to it later and eventually transform my notes into a publishable paper, So I just finished by saying thank you very much for this kind attention you gave to my ideas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Cesar. Thank you, Erik, for the discussion. Very interesting. And it's very nice that it's recorded, so we can come back to the discussion. And I found this very fruitful, in a sense, because I kind of tend to accept both views, but they have also some problems. But it's also interesting. I would just like to pose a question, Cesar, and maybe Cesar, maybe you can answer this, and also make a short comment to whatever you want to talk about, Erik's response on your questions as well, and then we can close this session to do a little pause. It's also always intriguing for me from a philosophical point of view. Some general remarks that have been made by linguists. Okay, maybe you can help me out, and you can also share your side on this, or your perspective on this kind of general remarks. Because some of the remarks, when I hear something like you said, they are very general and very strong remarks from a philosophical point of view. Yeah. When Chomsky says, how do you, Cesar, understand the remark, only human beings can do recursions? What is that exactly from the philosophical point of view? Because there is a counterpart of that, or maybe a more anthropological or more there's a Tomazello's view, which is only human beings can have shared intentionality, in a sense. Is that an empirical claim? What is the status, the philosophical status of that? Because it's very general. If it is empirical, how can we prove this empirically as well? I think methodologically is too strong to be prove empirically that. And how can we falsify it as well? Because whatever it did, I do not know if, I'm not sure if this Chomsky in this tradition will get it as a falsification of that thing, as an empirical falsification. It looks like a philosophical or even a metaphysical claim, because no empirical evidence is straightforward to falsify it. Yeah, it will resist normatively against any kind of falsification. Yeah? Both, not just Chomsky's point on recursion, but also Tomazello's point. And it seems like a plainly kind of a priori with some empirical evidence, philosophical statement that organized the way, a kind of framework of philosophical tradition and so on. But it's hardly an empirical claiming, because it's very hard to prove any kind of how would be evidence who might falsify this claiming like that. You will resist falsification bluntly. I think so. And that's my point. I just want to hear, when you read this kind of claim, how do you understand from a philosophical point of view? It's not an empirical claim. What do you think?
No, it's not. I agree with you. There's always a way of defending it against any kind of attempt of falsifying it. It's unfalsifiable. And the Chomsky approach is very much this kind of thing. You have the whole package, and then all attempts of falsifying such a position, that there is a number of additional positions and distinctions in place to help the Chomskyan linguists to defend the position. So it's very tight. Okay. So take, for instance, Everett's attempt to show that the Pirans do not have they lack the embedding. So Chomskyans have responded, have answered, saying, well, they may not have it in their performance, but they have the competence. So and that's perfectly defensible. Like Erik said, if then it always runs that way. You have enough munition to defend the claim, and likewise against Tomazello. There are a number of lines of reasoning against Tomazello's position. I think in my paper I could unpack this or give at least a map of different responses that Chomsky linguists have presented against Everett, against Tomazello, and they should have enough munition to respond every single alternative position at every level. That's the way I see it. It is a research program in the sense that like when you read Hegel for the first time, there is no entrance port to criticize Hegel. You have to face the whole thing, and then you are kind of in a very tight spot. Well, either I accept everything or I reject it entirely. So there is no middle ground. That's my feeling in regard of what you you just prompted, Marcus.
Yeah, if it's a philosophical claim, in a sense, for is as Erik pointed out, is in spirit. I like it, this way, that phrasing that Erik put. In spirit is very against other traditions. I mean, or this more the tradition that we showed, this post-cognitivist tradition, because it's very strong universalist and also with a priori strong remarks. Yeah, that resists falsification, empirical falsification. This looks like not science. It looks like more philosophy in a sense. But it's a philosophy in another spirit, in a sense, with another worldview. I don't know how to frame it. I don't know if Erik agrees on that.
Yeah, I think it's Chomsky is a self-professed rationalist.
Yeah. So
He sees the ultimate truth. Yeah. Oh yeah. I think I think deduction and logic is an achievement too. But if you're a rationalist, I think you have to be a Platonist too. So it's.
But then, in a sense, I really liked also what Erik Myin said. In a sense, the phenomena that Tomazello is referring to is interesting. It's nice, but the kind of account, in spirit is different. Yeah? I mean, so we can refer to the same phenomena in a sense, but then with different spirits and accounts and philosophical point of view as well, and try to develop these things. And I think it's very nicely put, this kind of view. No? We refer to the same phenomena, but with different philosophical point of view stands, and try to redevelop it, promote, these possibilities. So it's nice. So guys, now it's 11:40. Maybe you can do a 5 minutes break, and then we come to finish the session today.
But we can never finish at.
We can never finish.
We can never finish in the time that was foreseen. Yeah.
It's probably it's tentative.
Okay. Yeah. It doesn't matter for me. I don't have to. I don't have to catch a train or a plane.
Okay. But myself, I will have classes afternoon. So
Okay. So what's the plan? To have a short break then? Yeah.
Yeah, 5 minutes break, and then we come back. Okay.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you again. Hallo Chris. Hallo. Ik ben thuis, maar ik ben online in een congres over mijn boek bezig. Dus wat? Omdat nu 2 minuten pauze is. Ja, zeg maar. Brief? Mhm. Hello, I'm back.
Hi, Erik. Just
Hi.
waiting for Bruno to make the projection of my because I do not have this function here available for me. Okay, I'll make it larger here. It's working. Can you see it, people? Okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Just organize the windows so I will not get lost. Okay, guys, let's start again. It's me, Marcos Silva, representing here the grupo de pesquisa, research group NormAtiva from Recife, from the Federal University of Pernambuco, and also the board, representing the Brazilian Society for Analytical Philosophy as well. So this is my presentation. I didn't prepare slides as beautifully made by Cesar and Erik. I will read through a paper, a text that I've been writing these few last moments. We will just have a time here. So it's problematic. Yeah? So organizing, presenting, and also mediating my own talk here. So thank you for everybody to be here. And for Cesar and Erik's time and Erik's support, and thank you for Bruno Luiz for the organization also on the backstage, and Thiago Andrade, and also Fred Andrade from Recife. They are graduate students of mine who are working with me to organize this beautiful workshop. So my topic here is called From Affordances to Inference, Ecology, Normativity, and the Space of Reasons. So a critical engagement with Erik Myin of a different mind. Erik Myin's work, in a sense, I've been working with Erik Myin's text and work for the last decade, at least. So I was able to visit Erik Myin last year, I think in October, yeah, Erik, in Antwerp, yeah, in the University of Antwerp. And so we have many, some time together to talk and see new projects and how we can deal with all these ideas. And here's pretty much a call for an invitation for a future project between our groups and see what we can do together. So I will skip the introduction. So I'll go straight to this point because Erik Myin already did the presentation, also Cesar Meurer, and this is the last presentation of the morning. So the dominant image of cognition, modern philosophy, and cognitive science assumes that cognition fundamentally consists in internal operations individually performed over mental contents or representations. So this organism receives sensory inputs, processes them internally, and reconstructs the world through representation and computation mechanism, of what Erik Myin called in his book Mediationism. Okay, I use often the term, the notion, the concept of representationalism for that. So this framework rests on at least 3 assumptions that Erik Myin already presented for us as well throughout his work. First, cognition is an intellectual process. It is understood primarily in terms of intellectual operations such as thinking, representing, computing, reasoning. This kind of reasoning I will say a little bit more in this text about content which might be true or false. Second, cognition is an internal process. The relevant processes and intellectual operations occur inside the organism, especially inside the brain. Third, the cognition is individual. Cognitive activity belongs to isolated individuals rather than to systems of organism-environment interactions. I think one of the major contributions of Myin's book and of his work with Daniel Hutto as well is to show how deeply these philosophical assumptions have shaped theories of perception, cognition, and knowledge throughout the history of Western philosophy. So against this tradition, and activism and also ecological psychology begins with an organism already situated in meaningful environments, rather than asking how cognition reconstructs the world from some poor sensorial inputs. Ecological approaches ask how organisms directly engage with environments rich in information and possibilities for action. This is my point for this presentation now. The central contracts can be summarized as follows. So the world is not intellectually reconstructed as a kind of byproduct of individual intellect processing poor sensorial input. It's directly encountered as a structure, as organized through a long history of dynamic engagement between agents and environments. So this shift, this philosophical shift, has important consequences. Cognition becomes embodied rather than purely mental. It becomes ecological rather than internal, as Myin also presented to us, and relational rather than individual. Organisms do not stand outside the world and infer its existence or reason, as Myin nicely put as well, its existence from poor sensory traces. They are already active participants in structure and meaningful environments. So going to the second part of what I would like to say, the discussion of unconscious inference begins in chapter 3, and it occupies strategic position within his broader critique. Erik Myin's broader critique. According to Myin's reconstruction of Meurer, for example, perception is modeled on a detective story. As Myin writes from about Meurer's account, given that certain sensations occur, the mind posits certain events in the outside world that's causing precisely these sensations. So certain traces are present, and from these traces, the mind infers, or the individual infers, what must have happened to produce them. So Myin continues in his criticism. While the detective in the story might reason consciously, the mental operations evoked by Meurer or von Helmholtz are taken to occur below the radar or unconsciously. They are unconscious inferences. As Myin shows, von Helmholtz adopts and develops this model. So sensation becomes the premises, perception becomes the conclusion, the external world is reached only through mediating mental operations. As Myin presents this kind of account, this influential account, it is through the application of mental operations, in particular through unconscious inference, again, that is possible to bridge the gap between sensation and outer world. I think this framework survives in many contemporary theories. As Myin observes the poverty of the stimulus, argument assumes that what is given to perception is fundamentally poor and therefore requires inferential or computational, depending on the program, the philosophical program, enrichment. I find this critique by Myin convincing. I agree on that. Nevertheless, one of the points that I would like to raise here, for talking about these things to Erik, is what exactly is an inference? The examples discussed through this chapter suggest a very specific answer. Inference is modeled on logical reasoning, particularly syllogistic deduction. Myin explicitly notes that Meurer conceived unconscious inference through the model of the classical syllogism. So this is where my first concern emerges. The debate above often appears to assume that inference is essentially, constitutively, a matter of deriving conclusions from premises. I think to derive conclusions from premises is sufficient to have inference, but it's not necessary to have inference. This is the kind of thing that I would like to share here. So the only disagreement concerns whether such operations occur consciously or unconsciously. Yet perhaps the deeper issue is not conscious versus unconscious inference. Perhaps the deeper issue concerns the nature of inference itself. The first problem is intellectualism. Meurer's model presupposes the inference fundamentally resembles explicit reasoning based on structured language. But many forms of intelligent activity do not seem to involve anything like internal syllogism, or even in adult human beings or linguistic competent adult human beings who might look like the kind of model or reference or paradigm that these people are using to represent what has been done by inference, or inferring, or by reasoning. Another problem concerns content. Myin's discussion distinguishes the ecological approach from mediational theories. But for me, reading Myin's text, and I would like to hear more from Myin, is it remains unclear how content and inferences themselves should be understood once mediating representations are refused. Another problem concerns the distinction between reference and inference. Much of the modern tradition treats meaning primarily in referential or representational terms. Yeah? Yet inferentialists, such as Brandon and Pettigrew, argue that meaning also depends upon what follows from use and what's incompatible with it. Use is structured, or organized, conceptually organized. Another problem concerns the distinction between formal and material inference, which is very important to understand many problems here, I think, concerning the philosophy of logic and the epistemology of logic. I think Myin's presentation of Mill's account contrasts conscious and unconscious inference, but says little about the distinction between logical form, which render the reasoning as a deduction in a syllogism, and another type of inference, which is very important also for philosophy of logic, which is a more content-sensitive inferential relation, or other non-deductive forms of inference, as analogical and inductive reasoning, which might be more or easily naturalizable as this deduction-loaded inferential relation. Other problem concerns concepts as well. I think concept is not well developed in what Myin is presenting. I don't know what kind of theory of concept or view of concept Myin has there to offer to us. Maybe he can develop this for us here. What exactly is the relation between concepts and inference, for instance? A concept general representation, I think Myin would resist this idea. Yeah? But concepts are logical forms. What concepts are organizing? They are merely classifications, skills, rules, positions within inferential networks. How can we naturalize it? And how should we understand normativity, correctness, error, learning, and correction once inferential mediation has been rejected and we refuse a broader representation of its way out? And can inference itself be naturalized and embodied, or must it remain tied to intellectualist conceptions of cognition? So a third point that I would like to present here is what I'm calling here Pittsburgh inferentialism. Erik Myin presented some slides today where he put inferentialism, but I didn't recall, I do not remember by reading his book now if he's addressed directly inferentialism in this book. So I would like to hear more on that. Pittsburgh inferentialism becomes particularly relevant. One of Sellers, for instance, most influential contribution was his critique of what he called the myth of the given. That is, the idea that knowledge could ultimately rest on non-conceptual, self-authenticating episodes that stand outside what he called space of reasons. Sellers argued that even perceptual knowledge is normative. And for what Myin presents, normative is on this second level when we have already cultures and societies. Yeah? Normative is not in the perception or the sensations that we have, how we organize the environment. And but this is hard also to understand how to naturalize normativity and find normativity in the environment, in a sense. So meaning that it's embedded within a network of inferential commitments and entitlements. So they have this Pittsburgh school has normativity, yeah, when they have language and they have concepts there. This insight bears direct on the classical debates around the unconscious inference, to my mind. Both Myin and Helmholtz sought to explain perception by appealing to inferential processes operate beneath conscious awareness. While their accounts represent an important advance over a naive empiricism, they nevertheless preserve the assumption that perception requires the mediation of internal cognitive operations. In one word, inference that transforms sensory inputs into meaningful experiences. But from an inferentialist perspective, the problem is not merely whether such inferences are conscious or unconscious, but rather how perceptual episodes become integrated into normatively governed practice of giving and asking for reasons. This is where the distinction between formal and material inference developed by Sellers and later by Brandon, McDowell, Berger, and others becomes crucial. Formal inference derive their validity from logical form and the use of logical vocabulary. Material inference, by contrast, derive their meaning from the conceptual relations that structure our practices or our language games, if you want. So conceptual content itself is inferentially articulated. From this is red, one may infer this is colored. From it is raining in Recife, now it rains a lot in June, one may infer that street will become wet. So all this kind of inference or reasoning are not formal, syllogistic ways of reasoning. Such transitions are not merely psychological associations or mental or regularities of thought. Rather, they are normatively governed relations embedded in shared rule practice or language games. In this tradition, to possess a concept is to occupy a position within this web of inferential relations that determines what follows from a claim, for instance, what is incompatible with it, and what counts as evidence for it. The challenge then is not simply to explain how organisms perform unconscious inferences, as Myin criticized Mill's position and also von Helmholtz's position, but to understand how they become responsive to inferentially structured environments and participate in practice governed by norms of correctness. I think this framework offers resources that ecological psychology and some forms of activism sometimes lacks. Sometimes lack. It provides integrated accounts of concepts, rules, commitments, entitlements, reasoning, and normativity. The problem is Pittsburgh inferentialism faces difficulties of its own. So the so-called space of reason is often criticized, which in my mind is correctly criticized, for being highly anthropocentric, intellectually overloaded, and too demanding, because its focus is totally on the game of giving and asking for reasons, a very, in a sense, abstract dialogue. Is assertion-centered. It's not just speech acts that demands already a structured language, but also centered on the speech, a very demanding intellectually speech act, which is to assert things. So when you assert, you are committed with the what follows from the assertion. And also this Pittsburgh inferentialism is often criticized because of this disembodied point of view, and it's highly difficult to naturalize it, to put it contiguous to natural history. So rationality appears uniquely human, and that brings to us to Cesar's presentation. Concept seems detached from embodied action. Normativity appears disconnected from ecological engagement. So these are some problems, okay? Important problems here. So in short, inferentialism gives us concepts, rules, normativity without ecology and embodiment, while an activism on the other side, the ecological psychology, often give us ecology without a fully developed account of normativity. And then I will come to my final remarks when I try to bring both, and I would like to hear more if what Erik has to say about it, of it makes sense for his philosophical program when talking about reasoning, inference, and these logical relations in a structured environment. My final point here then is whether an activism, ecological psychology, and inferentialism can be brought together within a unified account of cognition, normativity, and rationality. I think the key concept for such a reconciliation may be Gibson's notion of affordance. Affordance of possibilities for action available to organisms within specific, structured, and this is important for me, structured and organized environments. Crucially, they are not restricted to linguistically competent adult human beings, which might be the focus of this Pittsburgh inferentialism. If you have a linguistically competent adult human beings, this is sufficient in a sense to have, in order to have inferences. But my point is that necessarily? I think it's not necessary, okay? A branch affords perching to a bird, a box affords shelter to a dog, a patch of flowers affords nectar gathering to a bear, and a trail affords navigation to a wolf moving through some territory. So a chair, likewise, a chair affords sitting, maybe a path affords walking, and a tree affords climbing. What is striking here for me is about affordances that they are not merely physical properties of objects or subject projections of organism. So we can use what means presented as a direct perception, okay? Rather, they are relational structures emerging from the dynamic coupling of organism and environment. More important, and that I would like to hear more about what Erik Myin can say about it. I think affordances, they have a modal nature. It's not just relation, it's a modal nature. They concern possibilities, they concern opportunities, they concern constraints, solicitations, invitations, and also dangers. They define what can be done, what cannot be done, what is worth doing for a species or organism, and what should be avoided within a particular ecological context as well. This observation suggests a possible bridge to inferentialism. Affordances are already structured relations that organize action and responsiveness. They are not random stimuli, but meaningful possibilities embedded within an environment. So a skilled animal perceives pathways of pursuit or escape available to another animal. A migratory bird perceives some kinds of opportunities to navigate. A chimpanzee perceives a stick or a branch as a possible tool for extracting ants from the soil. And they perceive all this and what follows from doing this, because they sometimes want what follows, the byproducts of doing something. And I would like to say that is inference, that is reasoning. It would be very hard to believe that nature would select animals or organisms or some animals, complex animals, in a very dangerous environment that cannot reason with the possibilities that the environment gives to them to act. So in each case, what is perceived is not merely an object, directly or indirect, but a field of possibilities organized by relations of relevance or maybe intensity, maybe compatibility and other materials constraints. So from an inferential perspective, this raises an intriguing question. Might affordances themselves possess an inferential dimension? And this is the kind of, I would like to hear more what Erik might say about that. Because they are structured in a sense. They are organized. They are conceptual organized, I don't know. Depends on the count of concept that you have. The idea becomes even more plausible when we consider skilled human activities as well. As animals. A football player does not merely perceive a ball, we have the World Cup now, but a set of possible of moving bodies. She perceives passing lanes, tactical opportunities, vulnerabilities of a defense, some patterns of to play. A marisqueira here in Pernambuco, working in the mangroves, she perceives subtle environmental cues that reveal opportunities for collecting shellfish or caranguejos here that is invisible to an untrained observer as myself. Erik used some examples by jazz. I use here for samba in Brazil. A samba musician perceives harmonic possibilities, maybe some tensions that invite or solicit certain continuations while blocking or discouraging others. And then we can go higher in a sense for abstraction here. Now, a mathematician often perceives a promising proof strategy before being able to articulate it explicitly. I think it's possible to set a little bit this affordance landscape here. In each case, what seems to be perceived is not simply a collection of objects, but a structured landscape of possibilities. There are some modalities, organized modalities there. So the environment presents itself normatively organized, containing paths that can be followed, some obstacle that might be faced or avoided, and some opportunities that can be explored. This observation allows us to formulate another question. As animals can directly perceive affordance for action, can human beings, and maybe other complex non-human animals, directly perceive affordances for reasoning or for inferring in their environment? For instance, can somebody directly perceive a contradiction? Or a mathematician directly perceive a proof? Can a philosopher directly perceive a conceptual tension, or a category, or path towards conceptual clarification? I think it's similar to ecological insights. What is perceived not merely objects, but possibilities, constraints, transitions, incompatibilities, and relations. So just as a bird perceives a branch as a perchable, and a predator perceives a new route as possible, maybe a logician may perceive an argument as valid, a proof as incomplete, or a set of commitments as mutually incompatible. So we'll skip and go to the conclusion. I have other things to say, but then we can talk more in the book symposium or in other presentations. I think Myin convincingly shows why perception does not require unconscious inference, conceived as an internal syllogistic processing. It's too intellectual demanding in a sense, for very down-to-earth practice that we have and that we share with other animals. Nevertheless, the disappearance of unconscious inference leaves open a deeper question concerning the nature of concepts and inferences themselves. Perhaps an activism or ecological psychology should not reject inference altogether. Not inference in a high demanding things when we already have language or societies or culture, but down to earth, naturalizing it and sharing it with other animals, non-human animals. Perhaps it should reconceive inference ecologically, shared with non-human animals as well. The most promising path may lie in understanding concepts, rules, and reasons as emerging from embodied participation in ecological and social environments as well. So affordances may provide the missing link between direct perception and normative cognition. So I can conclude with several questions for Erik Myin. For instance, when you criticize unconscious inference, are you rejecting formal inference, just for formal inference, or material inference, or both? What is the relation between affordance and concepts? Can concepts themselves be directly perceived? Are affordances already normative, or does normativity emerge only later? Can organisms directly perceive modal properties, such as possibilities, or opportunities, or constraints? So can an activist in ecological psychology explain rules without appealing to inferential structure? Can a logician directly perceive modalities, possibilities, obstacles for acting in the world as animals perceive also modalities? For instance, perceiving contradiction or proofs or conceptual tensions and so forth as analogous to perceiving affordances in the environment. Can the distinction between formal and material inference help preserve a notion of inference without return to cognitivism? Do an activism, ecological psychology, and inferential ultimately compete with one another, or are they complementary, approach to different dimensions of cognition? And finally, if unconscious inference disappears, what becomes of inference itself. So thank you for your attention. And now we can come back to Eric. Many things, Alex. Sorry, but then we have it's an invitation to talk, and then we're not finished here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I had a reaction prepared, but I didn't have the paper, so it's sort of reaction to a virtual talk. But I can use elements from it. But just one question. I was a bit distracted at some point. Your example of the formal inference is the yellow and color, yeah?
No, this is from in this tradition. Formal inferences are based on logical vocabulary. Yeah.
Yeah. Just A and B, therefore A. Yeah.
So this
The
one.
material inference. What's your example of material? That's what I really want.
That's with colors and with.
That's material. Yeah. Sorry, I was confused. Yeah.
Or maybe.
So yeah. So the one that has to do with the meaning of the expressions rather than the meaning of the logical expressions. Yeah, that's the thing. Okay. Can I use? Well, I have there's so much to say because you cover so much ground, and I really need to react on the spot because I just hear the trend of what you say, and it's much more than your abstract, of course. But a central issue is what is inference? What is inference? And then I ask myself, what kind of question is that? It's not a scientific question, right? It's not like what is the melting point of this substance, right? To answer that question, you just go ahead and you measure it, and there you are. But what is inference is it's also a decision. What will we count as inference? What concept? How do we draw the contours of the concept of inference so that we can work best with it, right? There's a stipulative aspect to it, I think.
Philosophical.
Yeah, and I think the one way of approaching that stipulative question is let's just stipulate it this way, and then it's clear, and then we go on after we've stipulated in this way. And that's the approach which I think in the work with Dan, in the way I have been looking at inference, now implicitly perhaps in the book, but now in more recent work that I've done and that I'm doing, it's this stipulative approach which I then connect with the radical and active view, in which inference is always about contentful stuff, contentful. So and that's with that in the background, or with these ideas centered on these ideas. I have these slides, some of which I will show, but I'll say a bit more about it. Yeah. Or I'll show it and then we can go on, right? I'll show, because it contains an answer to the question, what is inference? It even contains an answer to some of your other questions. It also contains an answer to the animal intelligence. Is there intelligence? And that's the way how I see it. It sort of goes beyond the book, but your comments also went beyond the book, I think. Okay, so I can develop thoughts on inference and my current position on inference by giving a version of the radical embodied cognition line which were developed in the books with Dan, and which reappears from time to time in Of a Different Mind, and it's a different a useful way of approaching these questions is for me to contrast specifying between being specific. Specifying is description. When I specify something, I describe something. I'm in the domain of representational content. What is content? And that's a common use of the word content. It's representational content. It's the meaning of a representation. It's what a representation pictures, portrays, specifies, tells in a way that can be true or false. Okay, you find these definitions of representation and content throughout analytical philosophy. You find it in many philosophers, and it's the way analytic philosophers use it for perceptual content in the way in which they use it for linguistic content. Its origins are in an analysis of language. Okay, but you have truth, or you have the possibility of truth or falsity, truth evaluability. Okay, here it is in Gareth Evans, where he expresses it in 82, as early as that. It's then the content view of perception. It's the idea that perception gives you this kind of description of the world which can be true or false. That's specifying, describing, characterizing in a way which can be false, or it's a high-end notion, right? And it places heavy demands. It has on what is able to do specifying. It requires a medium of specification, somewhat some like this canvas here. In this case, this is something which can make you form descriptions, and it has this truth condition. It requires that what is expressed in the medium can be evaluated for truth or falsity. Now, what can do this? It's very high-end. I said, what can do that? We know that natural language can do this, right? It allows for specification. It's a medium. You can specify the world in as many ways as you want, and when you have a declarative sentence, a descriptive sentence, it's something that can be evaluated for truth or falsity, and it can align or not align with the world. Okay, so the medium has to have expressive power apart from the world. The world is not its own description because it's just itself. In order to have a description of the world, you have to have this medium, which then can disalign with the world. It can picture the world in a way in which the world is not. Okay, that's the power of a medium. And we can also, I think, understand why natural language allows to specify, and that's something that has appeared in my presentation, in the discussion that follow, because I think we can sort of, we have enough, we can have enough confidence that in the evolution of language, something which is language emerged as a medium to create descriptions, and what Hutto and I call truth-telling practices emerged also, practices in which descriptions get evaluated for truth or falsity, right? When you have this context, you have the two conditions that are there for having specifying. And this is important, and this oh, sorry. Okay, contentful cognition is truth practice dependent. I've already said that it's a necessary condition for there to be truth. Truth evaluable, that you have this practice in which someone says something, someone evaluates for truth, practices in which we have norms for evaluating the truth. You can, hey, come on, you say this, but you look at the world, it's not true. Okay, we have these norms governing our evaluations of truth, which then apply to specifications which are made in the medium of language. Okay, with language, here's a way to say there's a means to mean in ways in which can or cannot be aligned with reality in terms of truth. Okay, the two conditions can be met. That's specifying, but it's a very high-end capacity. That's a constant line in the books with Hutto, and it reappears in Of a Different Mind. Can be contrasted with being specific. Being specific has to do with correlating, being causally related. Targeting in the biological world, being specifically related but not describing. In the physical world, my shadow is correlated to me. It's specific to me. Someone can compute my length from measuring my shadow and knowledge about the sun and where I stand, etc. But my shadow in itself doesn't describe my length, right? But it's correlated with my length. That's being specific. It has this special relation to something of correlation, but it's not describing that other thing, right? That's an extra thing which you would have with sentences in natural language sometimes. Similarly, in the biological world, in my brain, for example, there could be all kinds of processes that are specific for certain things, specific for certain stuff. I'll detail it later without describing it. And you can do a lot with combining specific stuff, I think, or building on specific, not specifying stuff. So specific stuff can target something, can be aimed at something, can be specifically related to something without describing, okay? And contentless cognition, what we call contentless cognition, is cognition that is specific but not specifying. And basic minds without content, this phrase, which was also the title of our book, says that there can be genuine cognition that is specific but not specifying. Okay, so you have cognition that targets certain stuff, that is related in certain ways to certain stuff, but does so without describing that stuff. And that's the whole thesis, I think, about that's the core thesis in the book. So linking it to animal cognition, animals can have specific sensitivities to properties. This dog can be sensitive to certain substances which can make it follow a trail and make it target a unique emitter of the substances that the dog is sensitive to. That's already quite intelligent behavior. But you can also have specific non-descriptive sensitivity to facts. This bird can wait till the monkey jumps, can sit there for hours and just wait for the fact to occur that the monkey jumps. Now this can all happen without the bird having a medium in its brain or in its mind that describes the facts, right? It's just entirely possible. Okay, again, I'm pointing to possibilities. And that's very interesting, and that's where we come to affordances. I think you can also have specific sensitivity to relations that is not specifying. You can be sensitive to smoke as it indicates that there's a fire and flee from it without describing that relation. And there could be very kind of complex relations to which animals are sensitive by just being sensitive to the relations without being sensitive to descriptions of relations. I can think, and I'm not going to expand on that now, you can think of simple animal communication, alarm calls, etc. in these ways. Another interesting example, which relates to one example which you gave, I think animals can be, you gave the example of termite hunting with sticks. Now, monkeys or apes, monkeys, chimpanzees, I think chimpanzees can sort out different sticks in advance before using them as a stick to fish for termites with. Okay, so they can be sensitive to a future relation to an event that a stick might have, and in the light of that relation, compare two sticks, put away one and take one to go on with, right? So specific sensitivity can be forward-looking. I think that's all possible. That's all documented. For example, in this chimp capacity. So specific sensitivity can be virtual if you want. But it doesn't need descriptions. I think there's no logical, compelling reason why you would need a description of relations in order to be sensitive to the relations. So how, but nevertheless, we human beings are sensitive to not only to specific relations, we are also sensitive to relations between descriptions of those relations. How does that come? Well, now again, as I said, I think that comes because of we have this, thanks to our social interactions, we've developed these truth-telling practices in which we have created a medium to specify over and above being specific, right? Now, these capacities for specifying must be based, otherwise you have infinite regresses, must be based on specific sensitivities. We must have, that's the anti-Chomskyan point, that we can learn language without having language. And that must logically be the case, I think. So, but nevertheless, in some way, we have come from being only sensitive to specific sensitivities to specifying sensitivities. Now, this raises an important question. What is then the specificity of specifying, right? Because ultimately, also specifying, describing is built on a capacity for specific relations. I'm going very quick, I know, but I think you can follow me. I hope you can follow me. What is the specificity of specifying? Well, it allows one not only to it allows us, sorry, that's what I have to say. It allows us to relate to properties, facts, and relations in a double way, via a sensitivity, a direct sensitivity, properties, facts, and relations, and via a sensitivity to descriptions of properties, facts, and relations, right? I'm going to end specifying, and now we have your formal sensitivities, allows for logic. Once you have practices of specifying, once you have practices of the possibility of uttering descriptions which are truth evaluable, you can combine them, right? And we utter series of phrases, and we can combine them, and combining them can be in the form of using logical conjunctives. We can say, if A is true, if A then B, A, and then we can say therefore B, right? Or we can say it's either this or that, and that can have a certain meaning, right? And why do we do that? Why do we combine utterances? Well, the utterances come linearly, but no. I'll skip this. Let me just say that we can combine truth values. We develop rules to attach truth values to combine to two descriptions at once. As when I say it's either a birthday party or a marriage. I can say that somewhere in my dialogue, but I need to stick to that. Okay, now this gives us this can play a role in dialogue. So I can because these combinations are rule bound, and I can evaluate your combinations of utterances in the light of the rules that we have. So if you have said it's either a marriage or a birthday party, and a bit later you say it's not a marriage, and then still a bit later you say it's not a birthday party, I will say to you, no, that can't be true. You say something wrong, because you said earlier it's this or that, and now you say it's neither of them. Okay, so you can. This is very quick, but there is a story about this. I can I can tell, and I can reproach you that you're not playing by the rules. And I think the rules, that's what I skipped a little bit. The rules have this are there because they order the linearity. You can't say anything at once, right? So you have to say it in a linear order, but the rules of logic allow you to bring a global order in your linear orderings. That's basically what I would want to say about why we have these logical rules. It allows you to escape from the linearity of a dialogue. There's much more to be said, but it makes sense. Right? In any case, we have these logical rules, and they are there only because we have these truth evaluable atoms which we can combine into complexes, right? That's what everybody agrees about. Okay, now this was a bit of an aside to logic, but I said before there's this double relation that is created by specifying, right? There's this double relation to things in the world. We can be related to properties, facts, relations just directly, or we can be related to them by being related to descriptions of these properties, facts, and relations. Okay? And logic is directly about the relations between the specifiers, between the things in the world, but it's directly about the relation between the specifiers, between the descriptions, but indirectly about the relations between the specifieds. I can give you a example of that. If one is sensitive, therefore, to logical relations, this implies that one is sensitive to factual relations. But if one is sensitive to factual relations, this does not imply that one is sensitive to logical relations. I'm going very quick, sorry, but I'll give you an example. So you can be sensitivity to if it rains, I will get wet. That's the factual relation. This implies that one has a sensitivity to the fact that when it starts to rain, one will get wet. Okay, this is just the factual relations. Sorry, yeah, I know it. I need to start it all over, this one. So, sensitivity to logical relations, sensitivity to the relations that are specified in a logical sentence. This always implies that one is sensitive to factual relations. That's right. So if I'm sensitive to something of the specifying order, namely, if it rains, I will get wet, that implies that I'm sensitive to the fact that when it starts to rain, one will get wet. Shortly said, if I'm sensitive to the relation that is described, or if I'm sensitive to the relation in the description, I'm sensitive to that relation itself, but I'm also sensitive to the relation as it occurs in the description, right? I'm sensitive to two kinds of relations, but the one mirrors the other. That's the point. But if I'm sensitive just to a factual relation, if I'm just sensitive to the fact or the relation that if it starts to rain, that I will get wet, I can be sensitive to that relation without being sensitive to its description, right? I could be conditioned to the getting wet from the rain and avoid it thereby. I don't need a description intermediating my retraction reaction, right? I could be directly sensitive to that relation. But if I'm sensitive to the logical relation, which is there in if it rains, it will get wet, I will also be sensitive, if I really understand the logical description, if I'm not just a machine reacting to it, I will be sensitive to the factual relation that is described by it, right? And I could be indirectly sensitive to the factual relation. If I'm a language learner and I've never even encountered that specific situation, but because of my knowledge of language, I know what kind of situation it would be if I would encounter it, right? That also happens. But the important point is sensitivity to specifications is something some extra thing on top of specific sensitivity to specific relations and properties and facts. Okay, and one can't conclude from sensitivity to specific relations that one also is sensitive to its specification, right? Therefore, that's the implication for animal cognition. Therefore, I would say this has implications for animal cognition. Animal cognition concerns specific relations and specific sensitivity to relations, facts, properties. But you don't need to assume that they thereby also have some sensitivity to specifications of these relations, facts, or properties. And that, if you pull that through, or if you build further on this towards inference, I would stipulate, please reserve inference and the sensitivity for inferences to a sensitivity to specifying relations. Only say that you have an inferential creature, not only if it's sensitivity to the relation between rain and getting wet, but only if it's sensitive to the sensitivity for the relation between the description or the logical expression. If it rains, then it gets wet. It rains, therefore I will get wet. But I know people are using the word inference all the time for what I call specific sensitivities. I know people are doing that. I'm just making a recommendation. I think in the way I do it, I propose it, it will avoid a lot of problems. It will keep what's really distinct. But there are many complications. Some of them which sorry, yeah. Can I continue for a few minutes?
We just, for the whole program and now for this morning, I mean, it's already afternoon here for us, it's still 1 p.m. for us. So we have for everything 13 minutes. You know.
Okay, so let me just briefly conclude because I want to allow you some, where was I? Of course, there's an important, yeah, that's what I want to say. There are important questions about how is it possible that you have these, what I call specific sensitivities, right? How can you be so intelligently sensitive to all these relations without specifying them? That's one question. Another question is, well, if specifying, as I call it, has this double nature, if it ultimately is also based on specific sensitivities, what is the specificity of specifying, right? What's so special about describing? If you can be very intelligent with just non-specifying sensitivity to relations. That's two questions. First question, that's the question, I think, how can intelligence consist just of specific sensitivity to relations, etc.? How is that possible? Well, that's the big question of embodied cognition, right? I think that's, but and the root, well, the answer that radical embodied cognition wants to give is it's happening. Is my answer. I think all the approaches converge. It's without representation, therefore without specifying. How is that possible? Well, I think we have to empirically see, and we might have to be less ambitious in what we will take as an adequate explanation. Perhaps as is perhaps visible in the current developments in artificial intelligence, perhaps there's just a physical story about how neural weights change and how structures develop under interaction with the world. Perhaps it just turns out that these kinds of systems, which are set up in these ways, when they encounter the structure environment, they, with all kinds of actions in it, they form the structure in which, well, they're adapted to the structure of the environment. That's very wrong. Perhaps that's all we can give. I know people are unhappy with such answer, but it's like Chomsky, who argues against Chomskyans who argue that the large language models have no grasp on language whatsoever. Perhaps that's not true, because the Chomskyans have a wrong view of what it would take to understand having a grasp on language. That's one side, yeah? Another side, the other question is, what's the specificity of specifying? Well, I think that's the area where the cultural evolution literature will give us cues. And how that all relates to the inferentialism, well, it's something I certainly want to explore in future work. I think there's lots of bridges, but I can't speak more now.
Okay, Erik, thank you again. And sorry for not having sending my text before.
Yeah.
There's so many things going on the backstage. So
yeah.
I see some of your points. I just want to briefly recall the examples that I brought for the morning of this morning today. So I totally buy. I mean, the idea, Erik. I totally agree with you that there is no need for description or any kind of representation or device in order to understand some of these formal inferences or some more deduction inference that you showed. I buy this, and also for logic and this kind of more anti-representational point of view concerning logic. I buy all this stuff. I'm also Wittgensteinian in this point. I think description is sufficient that we'll have some inferences there, but my point is my question is that necessarily? The answer is no. True. No? When you bring the specific sensitivity of relations, I just want to reinforce that the sensitivity of relations, the relations are organized in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
This is very important. They are organized in terms of incompatibility. I'm not talking about formal incompatibilities. They are or material incompatibility. I don't know what the name we want to give for that. Because, and I think this is all totally traceable for animals in the environment, in a sense. Animals, you agreed with me that animals are sensitive to these properties, but my problem is that the properties are structured. If you want to have things, they are logically structured in a sense, because these animals, they navigate very well in this structure, modulating their behavior to related to the incompatibilities, the material incompatibilities, not formal incompatibilities, but material incompatibilities. I can give so many examples about that. Yeah? If the prey is running, the prey is not standing still. Of course, I'm using language to describe it. But
yeah.
Why don't you use the? I didn't understand why do not you use the notion of reasoning for that. Reasoning. I mean, any kind of inference. So the animal is not reasoning when the prey is running. It's not standing still. If an animal in front of me is big, this animal is not small, and I modulate my behavior according to this incompatibility, among big and small, high and short. If there is fire, if it's hot, it's not cold. And if it's too intense, I might get burned. If I get close, I might be... So there are some inferences there. I don't know why we should not use the notion of inference without the description thing. But if a bird is flying to the right, this very bird is not flying to the left. And this bird modulates accordingly, because flying to the right and to the left simultaneously is incompatible, materially incompatible. But my point is this: how to render these incompatibilities without the notion of inference, without any notion of conceptual organization or reasoning. But when an animal modulates its own behavior according to the kind of positioning, if food is close, is far from me, if I run on the opposite way, I will not have contact to the food that I want. So I modulate the behavior of my core, I navigate with my body towards the food. This is not reasoning, not formal reasoning, not formal reasoning. The animal is not inferring. It's incompatible if the food is in front of me to go back. There is incompatibility, material incompatibility. This is not reasoning. I don't know why we should not. I think it's too anthropocentric to say that. Yeah.
I'm fine with some word that well, there might be processes in animals which are connected with their or which might be central to their sensitivity to relations. And I just, in this presentation, I just didn't want to call these inference, because then I had to use another word to distinguish that kind of inference with the descriptive kind of inference we have. But I'm fine with saying, stipulating, this is thinking, or this is reasoning. Perhaps I need to think about it, but thinking would be fine by me. And that's also of a different mind. I'm broad about thinking. I'm very broad about. I'm operating with a broader notion. I have this from Ryle. Broader notion of thinking than the notion of inference I'm now using. But still, I would need another way to make this distinction between process.
I'm not pretty much concerned about the name that you're going to give this.
Yeah.
My problem is with the
I'm certainly willing to acknowledge, but also there's much more to be said. What exactly happens, right?
Yeah, what exactly happens? We need a kind of account to render material, not formal. Material incompatibility.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. But there's many. That's what I want to do in future work on logic. There's many nuances that one has to be extremely sensitive to, and which have to do with this double nature of logic. Not logic is both something we make, but logic is also extremely objective, because we define it. It's like truth. We define truth as what's true independent of us, right?
But in ecological terms, Erik, if it's very objective, if an animal cannot really modulate its behaviors in his body or its body when there is a predator on the left, and if this animal runs to the left, it's very objectively for this animal that will be dysfunctional or die or injured in many senses. So it's incompatible to go in the direction of the predator and live, for instance. If you go to the left, it's not going to the right. So these things are organized in a sense. This is objectivity for me.
Yeah.
It's ecologically.
But how does that connect to the process of thinking?
Because this I mean, if it's not thinking, if it's not organizing, if it's not inferencing, if it's not reasoning, it will die. Very fast, in a very hostile environment. Sensitive to quality, sensitive to relations, and these relations are organized in terms of incompatible. If you have one, you will not have another one. And this has nothing directly to do with formal reasoning. That is true high and needs a language, a structured language. Let's agree on that. But I would like to understand this kind of organization behaviorally, objectively in an environment with full of incompatibilities.
Mm-hmm.
With your body. Yeah? If you get it wrong, it's not false. If you get it wrong, you will die.
Mm-hmm.
Very fast. And that's I would like to call it reasoning, but you can have another name for that. Kind of a modulation to regulate your behavior in your body, the position of your body in the environment according to the offers that they have.
Yeah, sure.
If you have one offer, you do not have another one. You cannot have both together.
That's what I would call sensitivity to relations.
Yeah. Okay. I would call it reasoning. The animal is reasoning or inferring things. I mean, it's not just relations, okay? It's incompatible relations.
I'm sorry?
That's a specific relation.
Yeah.
Relation of incompatibility.
Yeah.
You cannot have both together.
Yeah.
And I think animals, complex and navigate very well to understand or think or reason. I don't know the verb you want to use. Among this, not just specifying relations, but understanding, in a sense, or modulating its behavior according to incompatibilities, material incompatibilities. What follows from what's incompatible. You cannot have both together.
Yeah. But it's like,
if you fly to the north, you're flying to the north, you're not flying to the south.
Yeah. But I would still capture that in general under the sensitivity to relations, because the incompatibilities can be. This description, sensitivity to relations, is so general that it can cover incompatibility, can cover anything.
Yeah. So.
But still, Sorry. Yeah, we're done. Yeah.
We are talking about this since last year. We're not managed to agree with each other, but it's okay. Sorry about this, but Fabio put a question here, but we have to stop. I have classes in 1 hour, so
yeah.
Well,
we can pick it up tomorrow. Yeah. Well, we can see. Yeah.
I would like to thank Erik and also Cesar again, and sorry for organizing, mediating, being author, and also sorry for that. I should have not mediating myself in this discussion.
No, everything's fine.
Too much. But thank you, Cesar, again. Thank you, Erik, and thank you
very much
for the support on the backstage as well. We'll see tomorrow. This will be recorded, and all the questions can be sent to Erik as well, to his email for new projects there. Okay, thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Have a nice day.
You too. Thank you.
Yeah.